Referendum, our colleagues at Indigenous Community Television travelled hundreds of kilometres to speak to some of those who will be most affected by the potential change.
But those in the communities of Areyonga and Daria, Hyondamu, Tichikala and Santa Teresa say they haven't been given enough information about it.
Young one to the Palajana, Ngana Nyanga Kora Nyokoro Palajana, Kimini Yanka, Corn Porincola, Pakantako, Munawaka, Chudanka, Para Karinjako.
Koda Tanatuning, Kape Bangalkaduning, Palbalango, Palaning, Monocadini, Canbrago, Monoparla de la Man, the Capman, Katina, the Prepula, Mora, Odula.
Ngana wanga kanya ni ngana everything nyang community ni missing things ngana ngana ni wanga kolinda ngana ngonya ura palenda ngana oi ora ko
ngana chala kanang pe nanga nyambo voice parliament kirak ini kamilya bin ko jawa voice we nyambo na lawa
No.
Na Urpana.
tweet nganda nyambo voice ngutjumanda ken jak parliament kirakol kana wangan jak nyarbam ko jawa nyundo ting jaram.
Well, I don't know. It's pretty hard. I never realized.
Chira me panu ma jambu community anga surrounding ngane Northern Territory panu nya one each anga from every community in Northern Territory.
Kabuangam, we are to start back at school. Ngane lilanga.
Maybe ngurat mara hatta generendak interrup kudo kana temperature kaldo mane prime time na
And nya yundu maringe wilaring mara wele tikari young people langa wuri janjan ka langa ango take knowledge anga English wanga jako picture wanga jako picture you ngula.
Thanks to our colleagues at Indigenous Community Television for that report from remote Indigenous communities across the south of the Northern Territory. Indigenous Affairs Editor Bridget Brennan joins us now from Parliament House. Bridget, welcome to the program. We saw there that some remote Indigenous communities weren't getting enough information in the lead up to the vote. Do you think that'll change once we have a date for the referendum in the next little while?
I think Indigenous leaders and communities certainly hope so, Dan, because it's imperative that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have the information that they need to make their informed decision on the day when Anthony Albanese does announce the date. We think next month at some time. And I think, one of the things we heard at the election last year, Dan, is that there are a range of complex reasons why Aboriginal people, particularly in remote areas, often have a low level of engagement in democratic processes. And we heard there the range of different languages that people are speaking. So we need a lot of different resources for people in remote regions, including translators, language in language, information in language, information from Indigenous media. So I think from both sides of the campaign, it's important that those messages get to remote areas because these people deserve to have a say and deserve to have the most information they can to make an informed decision when the referendum is held.
Bridget, before we talk about what we're expecting today and really what that kicks off from here, I want to look to the past and go back to 2017 and the Uluru dialogues that culminated in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. You were there. How do you reflect on that time?
Well, Dan, I do reflect on that time a lot because I think this will be an emotional day for a lot of those campaigners and just ordinary people that were at Uluru back in May 2017. There were, influential leaders who were there, and then there were just everyday Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from different communities across Australia, from urban communities, regional and remote, putting forward their views on how best to change the Constitution to start to turn around some of the inequities that we see in everyday Australian life between black and white Australians. And so that was a very significant process. So I think this will be a momentous day for them, actually hearing the Prime Minister say we will have a referendum. It will be on this date after all of that advocacy and campaigning. Given, of course, there were different views expressed at Uluru. It was a consensus position, not a unanimous position reached at Uluru, but it was a majority position to put forward that Uluru statement from the heart. At the centre of that, of course, this idea for a voice to Parliament to be entrenched in the Constitution. So yes, this is an emotional day for those people that were at Uluru, and of course the many people involved in the push for constitutional recognition going back decades, Dan.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's important to acknowledge that the first calls, at least that were captured in the media at the time, were back in the 1930s, the Day of Mourning. There have been numerous calls throughout the year. The late Yorna Pingu powerfully called for constitutional recognition at different times, as did Loacher O'Donoghue as the first leader of ATSIC. So when you think back to that time and the Uluru Statement calling for voice, treaty and truth, and think about the year that we've just had with the politics around this and hearing from so many different voices, what do you think today means in the frame of this political discussion?
I remember speaking to someone at Uluru the morning that this statement was released, and not many people had had much sleep. They'd been up all night debating and finding the right words for this statement that will go down in the history books regardless of the outcome of the referendum. And that person said to me, the feeling inside the room was one of euphoria. It was euphoria that this was going to be the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander position on constitutional change at that constitutional dialogue in Uluru, the culmination of so much work. Now, of course, as I mentioned, Aboriginal communities are not one homogenous group. We are all going to have different views and positions when approaching this referendum. And so many people will bring those views forward. And of course, we've seen these campaigns being led diametrically opposed, the yes and no campaigns being led by very strong Indigenous voices on both sides of the campaign. But certainly there was euphoria at that moment, and then of course a bit of deflation when it was rejected by the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and his government of the day. So it's been 6 long years for a lot of those people at Uluru to get to this day, and I think many will feel vindicated that the referendum is happening at all after a lot of years where we weren't really talking about it in the media. A lot of Australians were not very engaged with this topic and debate, and now they're going to have to be, because in 6 weeks' time or around about then, we'll be going to cast our votes on this historic day.
Yeah, and when you talk about Malcolm Turnbull, he did move from that position, and in fact, in this campaign, we've seen him supporting the Yes campaign, in fact, at media events today, in fact. And what are you then expecting over this coming 6 weeks, where we're going to all be having to grapple with what this question means to us and ultimately where the position that we each individually take as Australian voters?
I think for the yes and the no campaigns, they're aware that there's a huge collection of Australian people who, first of all, don't really know how a referendum works and why it's necessary in our democracy, because we haven't had one in 25 years. So we've got a lot of young voters who are going to be looking at this for the first time, have no real understanding of the history of referendums. Also, a lot of people who are just really not engaged with the debate and the question. Of course, us in the media and many other people who are engaged in this topic are reading all the headlines and seeing the debate play out. But I think there are a lot of Australians who just haven't really heard much about it and are curious to know. So I think every single phone call and door knock for both of those campaigns is going to be crucial, and they're going to be looking, what we've heard is particularly in the suburbs, looking at multicultural communities who perhaps haven't had very much engagement, new Australians who perhaps haven't had very much engagement with our history or with Indigenous Australians yet. They'll be crucial to this vote as well. I mean, every single vote counts. That's what we heard from the the Assistant Minister for Indigenous Australians, Malarndirri McCarthy, this morning. She acknowledged this is going to be a tough fight for the Yes campaign. Some of that polling doesn't look so good. We have to get 4 out of the 7 states as a majority for whichever side is going to be successful. So, look, a lot of tailored messaging is going to be needed for different Australians from both camps. And also just work on the ground, meetings, town hall meetings, phone banking, door knocking, community events. It's going to be a busy time. And we do need to think about the health and well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people because, Dan, this has been a divisive and at times upsetting debate for a lot of Indigenous people.
Yeah, it certainly has been, and the bar is high. A majority of Australians and a majority 4 of the 6 states we're going to be watching very closely. Indigenous Affairs Editor Bridget Brennan, great to have you along. We'll be talking more to you throughout the day. Thank you.
And the latest we're hearing is that it'll be 11:40 that the Prime Minister will begin his speech. You can see our live pictures from there. But the Yes campaign actually officially kicked off their campaign in February, while the conversation around the referendum has largely featured politicians so far. There were none in attendance for the Yes 23 launch. Instead, the night belonged to community leaders and grassroots activists. Here's some of what was said.
Myself and my team have set up around this state to visit our communities and ask them firsthand, do you want a voice? Do you want to say in decisions that affect our lives? Do you want to elect someone yourselves? Should the voice represent our men, women, elders and youths? Should a voice report directly to the Parliament? Should the voice connect to the Parliament and to other parts of government? And like you've just heard, there was an overwhelming strong feedback on all points. Yes, 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 and yes.
Now, that was Dale Aegis there, the South Australian Voice Commissioner, making a very strong case in his words for the yes. Well, Ian Ham is a Yorta Yorta man and chair of the First Nations Foundation and will be voting yes, and he joins me now. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dan.
Tell me, what's at stake today?
What's at stake, Dan, is not only for Aboriginal people, but it's actually a point for Australia to decide what sort of nation are we, what sort of nation do we want to be. More critically for Aboriginal people, it's actually a question Australia has to answer. Should the Aboriginal people, or I say Aborigines because during this debate I'm not sure if it's 2023 or 1963. So really, Dan, the crunch is every Australian has to ask themselves, should the Aborigines be able to speak? And the answer to that is going to determine what sort of nation we are for probably the remainder of the 21st century.
Ian, you say you're not sure if it's 2023 or 63, but a lot has changed in that time. Are you happy with how this process is playing out?
I have to say, I think the Yes campaign has not really hit what it needs to with this. I think it's been caught up in far too much detail. It's fighting it like it's an electoral campaign as opposed to a referendum or a question that has a yes or no answer. Equally, I think the No campaign has focused on the Yes campaign not winning, has focused so much on that without providing, if we don't support Aboriginal people being able to speak, then what is the alternative? Keep doing the same? And we've seen where that's got us, which is basically not a lot and not very far.
Ian, I just want to go back to a bit of your story. I wonder if you want to share your upbringing and where that's placed you in terms of how you have these conversations.
Yeah, Dan, so as you and I have discussed, I'm one of the stolen children. I grew up in a country town where I was one of 3 Aboriginal children in the entire town, so Yarrawonga on the Victoria, New South Wales border. I have to say, being brought up in that environment has probably influenced me, well, along with a whole range of things, but that really set the tone for who I am and what I'm about. In those days, being Aboriginal was not something that you spoke about, was not something which people encouraged, and in fact, people discouraged you. This was the 60s and the 70s. People discouraged your Aboriginality. People almost wanted you to deny what you were. And as I grew up and grew older and found my family and found my community, and I'm extraordinarily fortunate that the family I'm from and the family I was adopted into, both good people, both good families. But that shaped me to see, why do people speak about my people so badly? Why are we spoken about as if we're just a series of problems that nobody wants to do anything about or gives cursory attention to, or really thinks a good day is when things don't get worse? That, for me, was built around one of the things which I observed, and then when I was in government, was ordinary Aboriginal people not really being heard, being defined as we are just a series of problems as opposed to what might we be, what do we aspire to be.
And we can see images in the corner of the screen of the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese arriving at that event in Adelaide, which will take you to when the Prime Minister takes to his feet to speak. Ian, staying with your story, and when you really generously opened up to me on the 1+1 The Elders series, it was heart and soul that we were talking about there. I've had so many Australians touch base with me after that, saying that they didn't understand or didn't have a touch point about your story or what being a member of the stolen generation, or as you say, a stolen child, meant. How much of what we're talking about this year is also about truth-telling and sharing the story about parts of our nation's history that are very difficult to grapple with?
Yeah, I think there is that underlying thing. This is where I suppose the questions that are being put before us in this referendum really make us reflect on who we are, how much of our own narrative as a country that we understand and are indeed prepared to own. Truth-telling is not about apportioning blame. Truth-telling, if you're a mature nation, if you're a nation that's ready to own all its narrative, not just the bits you like, but all there is. That's what truth-telling does. It fills in the blank pages of the book of Australia's story. That's what truth-telling will do. It'll make us a better people. It'll make us a more mature people. That feeds into asking this question now. Do we really understand where Aboriginal people are in our nation? Are we comfortable with where Aboriginal people are in our nation? We have an opportunity now to do something about that. So that's where truth-telling is incredibly important and will feed into, I hope, a better Australia.
Ian Ham, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and your insights. Ian Yorta, Man and Chair of the First Nations Foundation. Thank you.
Pleasure, Dan.
And in support of Yes, well, the No campaign was officially launched in Perth last week, where campaigners argued an Indigenous voice to Parliament would divide the country. They've pointed to recent polling, which suggests the No vote is ahead. Speaking at the launch was prominent political voices, including Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, Shadow Attorney General, Michaelia Cash, and former parliamentarian Warren Mundine. Here's some of what they had to say.
We have a long way to go. But every day, more and more Australians, they question, what is the voice actually about? And there is an absolute lack of detail for them.
Through this referendum, which is the most divisive referendum that our country has had to endure so far, I think all of us here are looking forward to it coming to an end so that we can actually get on with doing the real work and addressing the real problems that our country faces.
What are we going to do? Have a commissar of truth now in this country? The threat of freedom of speech, the threat of what's behind this referendum. As I say, like the team all say, if you don't know, vote no.
Taylor Gray is a Wiradjuri woman, lawyer and a PhD candidate focusing on native title rights. She's still undecided about how she'll be voting in the referendum and joins us now live. Welcome to the program.
Hi Dan, thank you for having me.
Good to have you along. Taylor, tell me, what does today mean to you?
Right, I mean the 14th of February, that's the tip date, that's ahead. But look, when I think about this, the proposed date that's going to be set in stone today, I think about how some nations have rain all year round, some nations have treaties all year round, some nations have elected parliamentary seats all year round. But here in Australia, we have this unanswered question of sovereignty all year round that remains. And I think everybody's looking for this fix-all or the proposal that is going to fix the unfinished business in this country. But on the 14th of October, so it's proposed, or what we're going to hear today, we leave the fate of our people to the majority of the Australian society. I just hope everybody is equipped with the right information, unbiased information, to make an informed decision for our people.
Do you think they are, Taylor? As we said, you are undecided. What will you do to make a decision?
I don't think I'm in any rush at this point to reach a decision. And I'm carefully considering the pros and cons of the advisory, of this voice to Parliament. But even with the date approaching fastly, I will not be rushed in my deliberation. But I think, again, talking to my elders, talking to the grassroots movements, and talking, to people generally in the public. When I was travelling just recently back from the Gama Festival, and there's a lot of misconceptions around the voice. I mean, one thing that arose out of my trip from in the cab ride to the airport was that with the advisory voice to Parliament, it's going to steal all of everybody's land. So there's misconceptions around that, and that's definitely not the case. When we talk about the advisory committee,
I might just jump in there. We're going to hold you. I just want to bring in the elder that's giving the welcome at the event in Adelaide, but hold on, Taylor.
My ancestors, your ancestors, wherever you come from, invite them here to look after you, to be with you, to sit with you, to travel with you on your way back home, but also to look after each other here. Help us to think about what we're doing here today, how we're going to vote. Walkandi Rikai Rumai Falca Ngayri Pakanamutano, Ngayri Pangari, Lewan Gana Rui. 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 Ngayring all the andu, 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 ngayring all the andu. Ngayring all the andu, ngayring all the andu. Ngayring all the andu. Ngayri Pakanamutano, Koranwarangi Pangaring open. Ngayri Pakanamutano, Koranwarangi Pangaring open. What I said in my language, I asked the ancestors from the 4 directions to come here and sit down in the land of the Ghana people, the land of my mother. The song was to welcome you and your ancestors here to this land. The words at the end, is asking them to take away any negative energy that comes with us as we travel across the land, that attaches itself to us. Ask them to take that away. So today, we enjoy ourselves. We look after each other. And we sit down next to our ancestors and make the right decision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uncle Major Mugi Sumner, for that beautiful welcome, and it was just stunning, so thank you very much. Our next welcome to country is from Jakira Telfla. She is a Malawiri and Mianya, the dry forest clan of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. She also has cultural ties and ancestral ties to the Narungga and Wari clan. Takara is a lead dancer for the Yalaka dance group, Yalaka meaning old wisdom and new ways, and the South Australian coordinator for the Yes campaign. She stands for the injustices of her people and for her culture, ensuring it's staying strong and alive as a carrier for the younger generations. Jakira will now share a greeting to Spirit of Place.
Namani, Nanari Jakira Wario Malawara Targetin Nyai, Nikorni Nadliarta Bukiana Medawandni Nyai, Targeti. My name is Jakira, second born girl, and I come from the Dry Forest clan of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide region. I'm also from the Wari people, the Wind people of the Narungga Nation on the bottom end of the York Peninsula. Ngai Chili Ninkomorendi Kumakai Mberendi, Tawalami and Ayarta. My friends, please recognise our spirit and our people and our place. I'm very honoured to be here to greet you to the spirit of this place, Mayuki, Mina, Yarta, which is the place of the northern wind and the northern people. And that wind is very important because it carries our message. And I'm sure that today it's asking us to listen, because that wind, that's how the old people come. And that's when they tell us what to do. And I want to acknowledge the old people that are in the wind today, but those that are in this place and those that are here in spirit that couldn't be here today to see this and to be a part of this, because we do this for them. And I stand here as a carrier of song and spirit and ceremony, and I stand here from a strong lineage of women, and I do this for my grandmothers. And it's very important to be here as a young voice and as a carrier of that. But I greet you to Tandanyaga, which is the traditional place of Adelaide, and it's the dreaming place of the red kangaroo. And it's funny that that kangaroo never goes backwards, only forwards. Yeah. And I think that speaks to how important it is that this is in South Australia, as we have before and will continue to lead in this country and in this world. Now I'd like to share a little bit of Oka, speaking in the same way, and thank you. I'm very honoured to be alongside Uncle Mugi Sumner as well, and to have that balance of the men and the women. But it's also just sharing some Oka, a very important thing for us in this country. Just acknowledging as well the four directions, but also the lands and waters that we gather on today, but the lands and waters that you all have come from to be here and to share this last breath. Thank you. Nakara.
Thank you, Jakira. Thank you. That was just stunning. Thank you for sharing with us and sharing culture with us today. So we all know why we are here today. just checking. So the up-and-coming referendum on constitutional recognition through a voice. Today is a truly historic day. Today we take the next steps forward towards recognition. This is a moment in Australian history unlike any in living memory. And getting here was not always easy. In 2017, after so many years of hard work, nearly 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders and elders from across Australia issued the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Together, they called for recognition in our Constitution through a voice. This idea came from Indigenous peoples themselves, an invitation for all Australians to walk together for a better future. So many people have stood together in support for the Uluru Statement and to a voice. And I am proud to introduce one of those people to the stage now. So please welcome our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese.
My fellow Australians, for many years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have advocated for constitutional recognition through a voice. Our government, along with every single state and territory government, has committed to it. Legal experts have endorsed it. People on all sides of the parliament have backed it. Faith groups and sporting codes and local councils and businesses and unions have embraced it. An army of volunteers from every part of this great nation are throwing all of their energy behind it. Now, my fellow Australians, you can vote for it. The idea for a voice came from the people and it will be decided by the people. Today I announce that Referendum Day will be the 14th of October. On that day, every Australian will have a once-in-a-generation chance to bring our country together and to change it for the better. To vote for recognition, listening and better results. And I ask all Australians to vote yes. Now, referendums come around much less often than elections. This will be the first one this century, and they're very different because on October 14th, you are not being asked to vote for a political party or for a person. You're being asked to vote for an idea, to say yes to an idea whose time has come. To say yes to an invitation that comes directly from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people themselves, a proposal that thousands of elders and leaders and communities all over our country have worked on for well over a decade. A change supported by more than 80% of Indigenous Australians. Constitutional recognition through a voice. A way for all of us to recognise Indigenous Australians and their history in our Constitution. And a form of recognition that will importantly make a positive difference to their lives and their futures. A practical way of dealing with issues that, despite all of the good intentions in this world, no Australian government has been able to get right before. The Voice will be a committee of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, local representatives from every state and territory, the regions, remote communities, as well as the Torres Strait Islands. A committee of Indigenous Australians chosen by Indigenous Australians, giving advice to government so that we can get better results for Indigenous Australians. The voice is about advice. The Parliament and government that Australians vote for in the normal way every 3 years will still be responsible for decisions and laws and funding, just as it always has been. With a voice, though, we will be able to hear directly from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities about the challenges they face in health and education, in jobs and housing. And we'll be able to learn about the things that are working in local areas so we can replicate them and make them work right around the country. Learning from communities in Arnhem Land, where the parents and teachers cooperate to make sure children are going to school and aiming high. Or the health services employing Indigenous nurses to deliver health checks and immunisations in remote communities. Or Indigenous rangers caring for our environment with knowledge built up over tens of thousands of years. There are local success stories out there. Just imagine the progress we could make with a voice connecting the regions with the nation. And giving locals a say, of course, means that we save money too, because we'll be making sure the funding actually reaches the people on the ground. No more waste, better results where they are needed. My fellow Australians, what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want for their children is what you want for yours. Staying healthy, doing well at school, finding a job they love, being safe and leading fulfilling lives. That's what they are asking you to say yes to at this referendum. The same opportunity for their children to make a good life for themselves. In the words of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, when we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. That's the change that we, as Australians, can make happen. Of course, voting yes won't fix everything overnight. We're talking about challenges built up over generations, and they will take time to address. But voting yes means we will finally have the right approach in place so we can start finding the solutions. We can make this change together, and then we will make it work together with a voice that's independent from day-to-day politics so that it can plan for the long term. And let's be very clear about the alternative, because voting no leads nowhere. It means nothing changes. Voting no closes the door on this opportunity to move forward. I say today, don't close the door on constitutional recognition. Don't close the door on listening to communities to get better results. Don't close the door on an idea that came from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people themselves. And don't close the door on the next generation of Indigenous Australians. Vote yes. Vote yes for recognition, vote yes for listening, vote yes for better results. Vote yes is a change for the better that all of us can make together. We all get one vote and we all get an equal say. And if something is unclear to you, or you haven't even had a chance to think about this yet, I encourage you, ask questions, because if you're unsure, it's easy to find out more. Have a listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders like Noel Pearson, Arnie Pat Anderson, Megan Davis, Marcia Langton, Tom Calmer and Tanya Hosh. Trailblazers working with the next generation like Yvonne Goolagong or Eddie Betts or Jonathan Thurston. or respected Liberals like Premier Jeremy Rockcliffe, Ken Wyatt, Kate Carnell, Sean Gordon, Bridget Archer, Julian Leeser, Fred Chaney. Have a read of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Just one page, full of grace and generosity, inviting all Australians to walk together to a better future. Have a chat to the Yes campaign volunteers at your train station or shopping centre, and have a look, importantly, at the words of the question and the words to be added to the Constitution. They're not long. The question is a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? Straightforward, clear, as are the provisions. It's the advantage of working on it for so long. First, the recognition. It says this: in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Peoples of Australia. That's what it says. Simple, clear, straightforward. Then the what? There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Again, straightforward, clear. The second provision: the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. That's the what. What will it do? That's what it will do. Straightforward, clear, unambiguous. And then the how, including a clear declaration of the primacy of our Parliament. It says this, point 3, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. Again, pretty clear, pretty straightforward. Recognition, listening to advice, Parliament continuing as decision maker. That is the clear, positive and practical request from Indigenous Australians. That is the handout asking us, non-Indigenous Australia, to just grasp that hand of friendship. And that is what we can vote yes for. My fellow Australians, our Australian story goes back 65,000 years. And what a privilege we have of sharing this continent with the oldest continuous culture on earth. But our story is not finished yet. It's up to all of us to write the next chapter together. And we can start by writing one word: yes. In the history of our great nation, the wonderful acts of national progress and the great advances in fairness have always required hard work. There were arguments here when South Australia, something they're very proud of and should be, led the world in giving women the right to vote. There were arguments made against federation and the minimum wage, Medicare and multiculturalism. And before the 1967 referendum, before Vincent Lingiari, before Mabo, before the apology. But the great story of our country through the generations is that Australians come together to answer these calls for change. We rise to the moment, like the kangaroo and the emu on our coat of arms. They never go backwards, they just go forwards. And so do we. When it's done, when we see the joy and the celebration and the difference to people's lives, the only question we ever ask ourselves when these changes occur is, why didn't we do it earlier? Yes. And it will be the same this time when we come together and vote yes, because we will have a way forward together. On October 14, there is nothing for us to lose, and there is so much for Australia to gain. There is no downside here, only upside. Friends, many times when I've spoken about this change, I've asked, if not now, when? This is it. October 14 is our time. It's our chance. It's a moment calling out to the best of our Australian character. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, this has been a marathon. For all of us, it is now a sprint. And across the finish line is a more unified, more reconciled Australia with greater opportunity for all. That's why thousands of people have volunteered already, many of whom have never worked on any kind of campaign before. This is a once-in-a-generation chance, and Australians from across the generations are working together to make it happen. I say to all those volunteers, keep knocking on doors, keep making calls, keep having those conversations with your colleagues in workplaces across the land, because this change is supported by employers and unions alike. With your teammates in every local club, because this is a cause backed by every single sporting code. With your fellow worshippers in every faith, because all faiths have given their support to this proposal. With multicultural communities, because they know what it means to celebrate and recognise tradition and culture. Have those conversations with your family and friends, your parents and grandparents, because with your energy and enthusiasm, this referendum can be won. And when yes wins, all Australians will win. So in a spirit of generosity and optimism, vote yes. In recognition of 65,000 years of history, vote yes. With hope for a better future, vote yes. Vote yes on October 14. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. I recently saw our Prime Minister at Gama, and I said it was the first time I'd ever woohooed a Prime Minister, and now this is the second time I've woohooed a Prime Minister. So thank you very much. Those words were just what we needed. They were inspiring and passionate from the heart. So thank you. Can we please give him another round of applause? So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who's Tanya Hosh. She's a Torres Strait Islander woman and a lifelong activist for constitutional recognition. She is the first Indigenous person and only the second woman to be appointed in the executive position at the AFL. South Australia's Australian of the Year in 2021 and a key campaigner at the Yes 23. So please welcome Tanya Hosh.
Stop, you'll make me cry and I haven't even started yet, and I'm a crier. I acknowledge we're here on the land of the amazing, resilient Kaurna peoples today. And I thank Uncle Moogie and Jakira Telfer for the tremendous, generous welcome to country. And I want to thank the Prime Minister for setting the date and setting a leadership standard for change. Thank you. There's so many other people in this room I want to thank, but there's no time for that. But you know who you are, and I wouldn't be here today without you. I'm honoured to be here today, to be part of this moment of significance, because every so often a defining moment comes along. A moment that teaches us profound truths about ourselves and each other, and in this case, about our nation. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and other Australians have been talking about this moment for a long time, and I mean a long time. My first crack at speaking about constitutional recognition came along when I was talked into speaking at the National Press Club in February 2013 on behalf of the Recognise movement. And back then I said, there comes a time in the life of every nation when it must put right the injustices of the past. A time to say no more to exclusion and prejudice. A time for us to be our better selves. A movement is growing to recognise the long and impressive first chapter of our national story and banish the lingering absence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from our Constitution. For remaining silent about the long and impressive first chapter of our national story, of this land, we are saying one or two things. Either this chapter didn't happen or that it is unimportant, and we know both of these things to be patently untrue. History is calling us. It is urging us to finish the work of 1967, when more than 90% of Australians voted yes. We answered that call unequivocally, emphatically. We were not daunted by the fear of failure. We believed in each other. We believed that Australians would opt for inclusion over exclusion, and we did. Now this generation has to complete the task. We're fortunate that the great 67 generation is with us yet, in spirit and body, and they guide us still. This is a historic moment in a long journey towards justice and recognition. It is a journey that long predates the Constitutional Convention and other processes that culminated in the historic Uluru Statement. But it was the Uluru Statement that gave shape to the ambitions we now seek to have reflected in our Constitution. The Voice proposal comes from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. The Voice, however, goes beyond a seat at the decision-making table and acknowledging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. It's bigger than that. It is an opportunity to celebrate and unite, as the Prime Minister has said, to make a great country even greater. An opportunity like this is not only historic, it's also rare. Today we have the Prime Minister, parliamentarians across the spectrum and community organisations throughout the nation coming together to say it is finally time to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our Constitution. Time to listen to the voices of communities on the problems they face and the solutions they need. Time to build a better future for all Australians. This is what the voice means to me and First Nations peoples. The Australian Constitution is ours. It belongs to Australians, and it's ours to change. It's a principle as old as democracy itself. A simple right to be heard when laws are made about us. And yet, 226 years after the British planted in a flag in a land that belonged to someone, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians still have no voice. But with clarity and determination, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have asked our fellow Australians for a voice. We asked on the Day of Mourning in 1938. We asked in the bark petitions of the 1960s and the Barunga Statement of 1988. And we asked in every major report for the last 30 years. And now we ask all Australians to stand with us, to acknowledge our remarkable cultures and resilience, and to vote yes with us to finally have that voice. Because what has our voicelessness delivered? Poverty and trauma, policy failure and heartbreak, disadvantage and devastation. This is the poisonous legacy of our voicelessness. And this is what the opponents of the voice offer Australia more of. So let's look at the data for First Nations Australians in reality. Let's look at the Close the Gap agreement. Target 1, close the gap in life expectancy, not on track. Target 2, healthy baby birth weight, not on track. Target 4, child development, not on track. Target 14, reduce suicide rates, not on track. Target 7, young people in work or education and training, not on track. When we are not making progress, what are we left with? In terms of our health, we know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people endure a burden of disease 2 to 3 times higher than non-Indigenous Australians. And now I want to share a deeply personal and real story about this data. It's too easy to speak of numbers without speaking about people and families and communities. A little over 2 weeks ago, I had my lower right leg amputated. And so, having left hospital only yesterday, I'm standing here on one leg today. No, I'm not clapping because I don't know much how longer I can do it. I have type 2 diabetes and I contracted a related disease that I have battled for 3 years and across 6 surgeries, trying to avoid the loss of my limb. I'm not without privilege and access to services, but still the service design let me down. I know that if we already had a permanent voice in place, there would be people around that table that understand my story, my experience, and what could make things better and different for me and for people like me. We have seen Indigenous advisory bodies open and close. We have been left without a durable or genuine say in how the matters that affect us are to be managed. And during the same time, if we continue to do things the same way as we always have, we will get the same results. This is all the no case offers. Leave things as they are, and that is just not acceptable. We can close gaps and make better policies by giving communities a voice, by doing something simple, by listening to the voices of communities who know the problems they face and the solutions they need. It is common sense that has escaped generations of non-Indigenous decision makers. There is a lot of noise about the scope of the voice, and some of it is genuine, but some of it is sheer mischief. And we say to the mischief makers that we cannot sit back while decisions that affect us are made without our input and without our expertise. We are not interested in being on the periphery of daily life anymore. We want to change life-altering policies that have made hardship seem insurmountable. We want to get out of the department of disadvantage and into the world of hope through opportunity and equal outcomes. So to meet this moment of history, this huge moment for our country, we have built the largest grassroots campaign ever seen in Australia. Last weekend, we knocked on 20,000 doors. This week, tens of thousands more. Our army of volunteers swells by thousands every week, and now they number 35,000. We are out at train stations and beaches, parks and curbsides. There are also long walks and visits to friends, everyone sharing the word and talking to people through the issues. And the issue is very simple: a guaranteed voice on the things that create inequality and keep people back. A guaranteed voice to instil hope and realise our national identity. On the morning after this vote, we will know something new about ourselves and each other. And it could be an either or. But if we vote yes, we will have seized the moment of profound national unity. We will ensure the first Australians have a voice when laws are made about us. And our generation of Australians will have delivered a moment of hope and a better future for us all. A moment of optimism, a moment of respect, a moment that says to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, we stand with you, we see you, we need to hear you, and never again will we not recognise your unending connection to this land. So today we call every Australian of good heart to action. We cannot achieve a resounding yes without you. So we need every single supporter off the sidelines and into the campaign, organising, activating, door knocking, handing out, making calls, talking to Australians in every waking minute between now and Judgment Day. We cannot waste a single minute or hour or day. We ask you to ask everyone you know to sign up at yes23.com.au, to volunteer everything you can between now and that vote in 6 weeks' time. Let's leave everything on the field, no stone unturned, and let's get this done. It's the fair thing to do, it's the just thing to do, and it's the right thing to do. Let's honour the 1967 referendum result. Let's again get together and get this done. Vote yes.
Thank you, Tanya, for such a motivational speech, and may the spirit of our ancestors be with you in your healing journey. We thank you for being with us on this very special day. Our Our next speaker today is Professor Megan Davis. She is a Cobble Cobble Aboriginal woman from the Barungum Nation in southwest Queensland. Earlier this year, we caught a glimpse of what drives Megan as she was featured on Australian Story. It's hard to believe that any young person would be walking around with a copy of the Australian Constitution in their back pocket. But that was exactly what she did. Some would say it was the start of her work in the constitutional reform. For more than a decade now, Megan has been advising, challenging and campaigning to get our mob into the Constitution. In 2017, on the anniversary of the 1967 referendum, Megan read the Uluru Statement to Australia for the first time. 6 years later, we are on the cusp of turning that invitation into a reality. So please welcome the co-chair of Uluru Dialogues, Professor Megan Davis.
Well, here we are, 6 long years since the Uluru Statement from the Heart was issued to the Australian people as an invitation to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. We are here, October 14. We are now under 7 weeks away from a historic ballot where the nation will finally recognise the First Nations people of Australia in the Constitution. Drafted in the 1890s, the Constitution expressly excluded our people for 67 years. We were not part of the national story. This referendum is about correcting this. It is about recognising First Nations peoples through a voice. I studied constitutions because they do have a role in shaping a nation and its culture. Constitutions create the material conditions that allow populations and communities to flourish. This is why they are so important. Our Constitution has done a pretty good job for most Australians, but not for all. We were excluded from the constitutional order. 1967 was momentous because it neutralised that exclusion. But the manifestation of that original exclusion is difficult to erase without change, without structural change and recognition. That is what this referendum is about. This referendum is about positive empowerment, recognition through a voice. 6 years ago, when our men and women in the regional dialogues were asked, "What is meaningful recognition to you?" What was their answer? They chose recognition as having a more active role in the democratic life of the Australian state. They chose recognition through a voice. Now, I want the politicians to close their ears because I'm going to say that not everyone wants to be a politician. And our First Nations men and women in the dialogues who live in communities, they choose to stay on country and devote their lives to the service of their people, of their culture, of their communities. They should not have to move to Canberra to have a say in the laws and policies made about their lives. They should not have to be personal friends with bureaucrats or politicians or have ministers on speed dial in order to influence the way their communities are funded and the way resources are allocated. This is why recognition through a voice is an effective way to bring empowerment and accountability to Indigenous affairs. That will lead to better quality laws when we are at the table and better quality policies when we are at the table, because consultation will no longer be superficial. Consultation will no longer exclude our communities, and we will have better outcomes and better results because of that. We know that well over 80% of our communities support a voice. We also know that those who don't support a voice get 80% of the media coverage. But our people are a pragmatic and practical people. When I hear some people say, the voice is not strong enough, how can anyone ever say that our voices, together, united, is not strong enough? This is about changing the way we do things in communities. It is about recognising our communities through a voice. It is about listening, and it is about acting. Best practice globally tells us that human beings are more likely to flourish if they have control over their lives, to dream, to have vision, to plan. This is what the voice is about. It permits our people to have a seat at the table. The drafters of the Australian Constitution did not leave it to politicians to change the Constitution, and there are many constitutions in the world like that. They could have. Instead, they left it to we, the people. This is about our agency as Australians to make change together. This is about unity of purpose. At Uluru in 2017, our old people said, let's write a one-page logic to the Australian people for why we need this change. Recognition through a voice. We thought all Australians can see that the status quo does not work for our people. And after all that has happened to our people, they chose to offer an olive branch, a hand of peace, a hand of friendship, to unite the nation. We invited our fellow Australians to be part of the solution, to listen to us, to walk with us, to use your voice to help give us one. Recognition through a voice. Our people chose to present a one-page invitation, an opportunity, a roadmap to a solution. Not more of the same, not the status quo, not business as usual. A vote for no is an endorsement of no change. It is a vote for the status quo. In the Uluru Statement, our people chose generosity, we chose unity, we chose real change, and we chose love. And 6 years after we read out the Uluru Statement to the Australian people, the time is now to vote yes. And again, we ask all Australians on this very important day to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. It's truly inspiring. Thank you so much for the work that you've been doing too. We very, very much appreciate it. Now, every one of our speakers today has been absolutely fantastic, telling their own stories and their journeys that they have shared with us. But the one thing that unites them all and is an absolute commitment to delivering a yes vote in the referendum, which is, we now know, will be October the 14th. Thank you for that. And it's places like here in Elizabeth and across South Australia that we know are going to make a difference in getting the vote that we want to see. So closing here today is someone whose determination to deliver the vote is beyond question. He knows only too well what a yes vote will mean here in South Australia, but also across the country. So please give a huge welcome to South Australian Premier Peter Malinauskas.
Prime Minister, friends, we stand here with our feet firmly on the lands of the Kaurna people. I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. But the way we pay our respects here in South Australia is not with our words, but in our deeds. Prime Minister, you have chosen to launch this campaign here in South Australia. It is not a coincidence of history that the campaign to launch the 1967 referendum also started right here on Kaurna Yurta. But allow me to speak plainly. I don't know how South Australians will vote on October 14. None of us do. But what we do know is that South Australians are capable of making the really big decisions at the really important moments. That's because South Australians have always been ready to lead, particularly when it comes to taking the aspiration of the fair go and transforming it into a living truth. That's why this was the first place anywhere in the world to adopt universal franchise, giving women the right to vote and the ability to run for Parliament. That's why this is the first state to outlaw discrimination on the basis of race or ethnicity. That's why this is the first state to decriminalise homosexuality. That's why we were the first state to legislate on Aboriginal land rights. These changes were all met at the time by opposing voices, predicting vague and terrible consequences, all of which mysteriously never materialised. In fact, the opposite is true. Each of those changes made our great state even greater. Because, to put it simply, South Australians care about one another. And that is also true of our nation as a whole. We live in an amazing country. We are resourceful, innovative people with living standards that truly make us the envy of the world. But what sets us apart isn't mineral wealth, sustained economic growth, or natural beauty. It's something deep within our national character. We don't celebrate the primacy of the individual in the way they do in the United States, nor do we identify with the deference the English pay to their establishment. Our national identity is carved from an ethos of egalitarianism, our fundamental sense of fairness, an affection that extends beyond those to whom we are related. Our national identity is found in each other. It's a unique, liberating trait. It's what's allowed us to open our hearts with warmth and generosity to those who have come across the seas. We have welcomed waves of migration, people coming in any number of circumstances. And each and every day, we enjoy the benefits of living with and learning from a rich diversity of perspectives. We are right to be proud of what we have built together. The peace, the prosperity, the potential. It's a remarkable Australian success story. But running parallel is a remarkable Australian tragedy. It is plainly unjust that of all the cultures, colours, creeds, languages, ethnicities that now call this land home, there is only one that is so much more disadvantaged than all the rest. There is only one group of people who has too often been left behind over the last 200 plus years. And tragically, they are the very people who for over 65,000 years provided great care and custodianship to the land everyone else calls home today. But yet, despite the history of dispossession, displacement and despair, in May 2017, our First Nations people came together from across the continent in one of the largest efforts in the history of our modern nation to consolidate all of their hopes, their aspirations into one extraordinary document, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The best distillation that I've heard on the message of the Uluru Statement from the Heart was made in a recent speech at the Adelaide Town Hall by a man who is in this room today, Mr. Noel Pearson. In that speech, following the reading of the statement, Noel described it in these words. No, I don't pretend to do your words justice, but they are worthy of repetition. Faith, hope, love. The Uluru Statement from the Heart is about faith in the possibilities, faith in the Australian people, faith against so much history of undeserving of faith. How can a people against whom so many faithless acts were performed over 2 centuries revive a faith in their own country? And yet Uluru is a statement of faith. It's also a statement of hope. From the bowels of despair about our place in this country, we have an expression of hope for the future. And love. This is about bringing the country together. It is about our love for our own country, notwithstanding the lack of love that our people have experienced for too long in this, our own home. We don't know what the outcome of this referendum will be, nor does anyone know the outcome on the October the 14th. But we do know this generation of Australians are descendants of all those who have chosen to act with generosity and foresight before us. If our forefathers and mothers can say yes to universal franchise, if our great-grandparents can say yes to waves of migration, if our grandparents can say yes in 1967, if our parents can say yes to land rights, then this generation is capable of saying yes to an advisory committee. in 6 short weeks, when we wake up on October 15, we need to be able to look our neighbour in the eye and honestly say, we did our bit. We accepted the invitation. We played our part in the long lineage of Australian acts of generosity. When we cast our votes, allow us to summon the courage to be motivated by faith, hope and love, motivated by the pursuit of a better future over an unsatisfactory status quo. Australians care about one another, always will care about one another. Let's give Indigenous Australians a greater say over their futures. Let's give them a voice to Parliament. Let's vote yes on October 14th.
Thank you, Peter. You're not only a wonderful human, but you are a wonderful Premier. So thank you for your strength in your words and your commitment and your passion. Thank you very much. Can we please thank Peter again? So I look around this room and I see just magnificent humans that have been a huge part of where we stand today. And I want to thank all of you, and I think we should thank them all. We can't go through their names, but we can see them and we can thank them with our applause and our love. So thank you very much for what you've been doing.
Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Ros Childs.
And I'm Dan Borsche, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. Well, the Prime Minister has just announced the date for the Voice to Parliament referendum, Saturday the 14th of October.
In 6 weeks' time, Australians will be asked to vote yes or no to officially enshrine an Indigenous voice into the Constitution. The permanent body would represent First Nations people and offer advice to government on policies and laws which impact the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
For the referendum to be successful, it will need support from the majority of Australians as well as the majority of voters in at least 4 states. There's been heated debate about the voice and differing views across the nation, including a range of perspectives from the Indigenous community. This is the first referendum in Australia since 1999, when Australians voted against becoming a republic.
The Prime Minister's decision to announce the referendum date in South Australia today suggests the government believes it'll prove a key state for the Yes campaign to win. Mr Albanese has called it a once-in-a-generation chance to recognise First Nations people in the Constitution.
Our Indigenous Affairs editor Bridget Brennan begins our coverage from Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome back, Bridget. Tell me, what did you make of that announcement, those speeches, very impassioned speeches just now?
It certainly was, Dan. It was a room full of energy as the Prime Minister got up to speak. A very large round of applause for the Prime Minister, announcing that the date of the referendum will be October the 14th, which was widely tipped to be the date. We now have that as confirmation, and the campaign will begin in earnest from here. It was a room full of South Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and of course, as you and Ross just mentioned, South Australia is shaping up to be a key battleground state in the run-up to this referendum, because every state counts. There needs to be a majority of states and a majority of voters, a double majority, if you like, for a referendum to be successful. So, look, Anthony Albanese is putting everything on the line here. This is a very bold proposal for a referendum, but he says it should be just a simple change for Australians to consider. He appealed to their grace and generosity and wanted Australians to really have a chat, really scrutinise and have a look at the voice to Parliament, have a look at the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was put out in 2017, Dan, by about 250 Indigenous leaders, and it really was the inception of this idea that's now being put to the Australian people to decide. So an impassioned campaign launch, launch for the date, if you like, there in South Australia. And we also heard from Professor Megan Davis, who says it's time to correct the inequalities in our Constitution, as she put it. She said the Constitution works for a vast amount of Australian people, but it doesn't work for Indigenous people. Again, reminding us of the Yes campaign's point of view that if Indigenous people can have some more input into the laws and policies that affect communities, all Australians will get better outcomes.
And Professor Megan Davis, beginning with a battle cry, if you will, of "We are here." The Prime Minister also spoke of this being a once-in-a-generation chance to bring our country together and to change it for the better. But we know, Bridget, that for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, this has been a really fraught year, as essentially our right to exist in many instances is being debated. What have you been seeing and hearing?
That's right, Dan. And I think today in Adelaide we saw a lot of warmth and hope in the room there for the Prime Minister's announcement of the date. But outside of that room, yes, this campaign is shaping up to be divisive and difficult for Indigenous people. I mean, the people who brought this campaign forward know that. They believe in this and they want to have this fight. But of course, it is going to be difficult to see our lives and our rights debated in the public sphere. And that's going to intensify as we run up to the date of October 14th, that Saturday, when Australians will be required to go to the polls and answer yes or no on this question. I think it's been a difficult year for Indigenous communities, and you have to remember a lot of Indigenous communities are already under strain, are just fighting for survival. There are still so many inequities, so many gaps to close for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so, you know, whatever side of the debate you're on, this debate that's now involving all Australian people, some of whom may not have ever had much engagement with Indigenous Australia, it could be a fraught time for some. But of course, we're not a homogenous community. There are going to be many different layers and views in the Indigenous communities as there are in the wider Australian communities.
Yeah, it's a really good point about the range of views. And in a sense, this year has also raised a whole lot of discussions that Ian Ham, for instance, earlier said was akin to truth-telling. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you're hearing and seeing in terms of some of the different Indigenous perspectives about the way forward?
Look, I thought it was interesting earlier, Dan, we heard from some members of remote communities who said they haven't really had much detail about what the referendum is all about. A lot of those people said they were inclined to vote yes, but they weren't really sure how the Voice to Parliament would work or even how the referendum would work. We have a very young Indigenous population in Australia. The majority of us are under 40. And so these people will likely have never seen a referendum before. It's been 25 years since Australia's held a referendum. So like many other people in younger generations from different communities across Australia, young Indigenous Australians will be wanting to know how this will affect us. And I think also this is a campaign that will largely be fought online and on social media. That's where most of our interactions, many of us, where most of our interactions occur now. It is on social media, it is online, and so that's going to be a different campaign, and it will mean a different type of debate to what we saw in 1999. So the health and wellbeing of Indigenous Australians, I think, will be challenged through this campaign, but we heard from the campaigners today, Tanya Hosh, Professor Megan Davis speaking there, and other South Australian Aboriginal leaders talking about the need to do this. They really believe in this and they know it's going to be a difficult fight, but they think it's a necessary one, Dan.
Indigenous Affairs Editor Bridget Brennan, thank you.
Let's get some detail now on the voting process. Tom Rogers is the Australian Electoral Commissioner and he joins us now. Tom, thank you very much for being with us. So we all know the date, October the 14th. What happens now for you?
Well, we're already preparing, and we have been for some time. It's such a large event and such a complex event. What citizens will see once the writ is actually issued, that we'll start a whole range of other processes. This will look and feel very much like a federal election, which the same sort of voting services available, overseas voting, voting in person, postal voting, and all of that will now start to kick into gear as we get closer to the actual day of the referendum itself.
OK, so what should people be doing and checking now to make sure that they can vote October the 14th?
So already the electoral roll is in the best shape it's ever been since Federation, and that's been a long-standing task of the AEC. But what I'd urge people to do right now is to jump on and check their enrolment to make sure that their enrolment details are accurate, to make sure that their vote in the referendum counts. And just while I'm here, secondly, they might also consider working for us. And there's a place on our website where we're urging people who might be able to see their way free to work for us to do so. We need a big workforce, about 100,000 people. Neutrality requirements exist, but please, if you're thinking that you could work for us, we'd welcome your name on the list.
Is that something that you offer for elections in general?
Absolutely. It's one of the, on the day it's delivered, one of Australia's largest workforces. I think at the last election, we had 105,000 people working for us. These are members of the community who help us deliver the event, and it's so important. So again, please consider doing that, but also check your enrolment details at the same time and read on the website about how you might be able to access the vote to make sure that your voice counts.
And come referendum day then, Tom, what will voters be presented with? What will the ballot paper look like? And also there was some controversy over whether voters should use a tick or a cross in the box that they choose. Can you clear that up for us?
So already people will be receiving in their letterboxes a pamphlet from the AEC with the yes and the no case presented, and some information from the AEC on the voting process. If you flip that over to the back, it's got example ballot papers and how to complete a formal ballot. The way to make sure that your vote counts is to write either yes or no, or to deal with the conspiracy theories, either no or yes, depending on what you want to do, in English, in full on the ballot paper. And if you do that, that way your vote will count. There has been some misinformation about the voting process over the last week. I'm really urging everyone to write yes or no in full on the ballot paper, and that way you can make sure your vote actually counts. There is some provision, some savings provisions that are unremarkable, in that savings provisions have been in the electoral law space for over a century, ticks and crosses with referendums for over 30 years. The AEC is applying the law that Parliament passed, that Parliament intended. I think at the last event, the formality rate was 99% of Australians wrote either yes or no, so I'm urging people to do that for this event as well.
That's when you say there that there's been misinformation about the voting process over the last week. Can you just explain what you're referring to there?
I'm even nervous talking about it because every time I say it, it inflames an issue that's a non-issue even further. I just urge people, please, if you want your vote to count, write either yes or no. But like at every election for over a century, there are certain provisions in the Act which enable the AEC, enable the electoral authorities, watched by scrutineers, to give effect to the choice of voters. And so there's been some discussions about the issue of ticks and crosses. Again, we put out a media statement last week. I don't want to add to it because it's further inflaming it. Please write yes or no to make sure that your vote will count.
Okay. One of the criticisms from remote communities, Tom, in Central Australia is that a lot of information from the Electoral Commission, your body, is in English, which often is a third or fourth language spoken by people living there. And if you're asking them to write yes or no, that's going to be an issue as well, isn't it?
We do provide a lot of translated materials, and at the last election, forgive me if I get this wrong, but we translated a lot of our materials into something like 34 culturally and linguistically diverse languages, and well over 15, might have been as many as 20 Indigenous languages. We also provide, we've got a separate Indigenous Facebook page. We provide in-language materials, support. We've had partners in communities going around to those Indigenous communities explaining how to cast a formal vote. That will continue. There's a heap of information already that people can access, and I'd urge them to do that to make sure they're informed about the process.
And Tom, do people in remote communities vote earlier than the rest of the country? There's such an important group of people in this referendum. If that's so, does that have implications for the campaign process? There's less time for locals to make up their minds, isn't there?
At every election in Australia, there is a thing called pre-poll voting, and that is available to everybody. And I saw the announcement at the same time as you did. So the 14th, there's normally 2 weeks of pre-poll voting. So most Australians will access, who need to access pre-poll voting, will do so from whatever date that is, the 2nd of October. In remote communities, those extreme remote communities, as we start to do remote mobile polling with our remote voter services offering, that will be for a slightly longer period. But again, it's such a big task to make sure that we give everyone the opportunity to have their say. We're working with those communities at the moment to make sure that they're aware of when we're going to be there and how they can cast a vote. People are probably not aware that at every election we use cars, four-wheel drives, planes, helicopters, occasionally boats, to get the vote out to remote communities. We really take remote voter services very seriously to make sure that all Australians are going to be able to have their say. For this event, we're returning to pre-pandemic levels of service delivery for the overseas vote, for example. I think there'll be something like about 100 of our overseas missions where voting will be available in person. So we provide a really comprehensive service to make sure that all Australians can have their say.
So 6 weeks of campaigning now begins. What's your advice to voters as they read, watch, listen to the campaigns of both sides and to the general noise and chat that will be around?
Well, a few things. Remember, voting is compulsory. It's the same as for an election. So please, I'm urging everybody to make sure they understand voting in the referendum is compulsory. They must do it. Secondly, make sure you consume all the information. If you are at all worried, please visit our website where there's a heap of information, including even a practice voting tool, so that you can practice casting a formal vote. Please consume that, look at it, visit our website and talk to people if you need to.
The Australian Electoral Commissioner, Tom Rogers, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, now that the date's been confirmed, campaigning from both the yes and the no camps will certainly ramp up. Our political reporter Dana Morse breaks down the arguments from both sides as they try to win your vote.
We now have a date for the referendum on an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. October 14th has been announced as the date when Australia will vote on whether to establish an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. It's not long until Australia heads to the polls and both the yes and no camps will be looking to secure your vote. So what are their arguments? Let's start with the case for the voice. There are a lot of different groups working together to try and get a yes vote over the line. They include the Uluru Dialogues, the same people behind the Statement from the Heart that put forward the Voice, Treaty and Truth proposal, the official campaign group Yes23, the federal government led by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and all of the state and territory governments too. The Yes case also has the support of some of the most recognisable organisations and companies in Australia, including Qantas, the AFL, Telstra and the Commonwealth Bank. There are two main arguments from the Yes case for creating the voice, and that's respect and recognition.
We've been trying for a long time to get, acknowledgement, recognition, or to be included in the political life of the nation and be part of it.
Those behind the vote have been campaigning for change for many years. They say Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people deserve a say in matters that affect their lives, and that governments should have to consult with a representative body on laws and policies that affect them. The Yes camp say Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be recognised in the Constitution, and believe it's no longer acceptable for Australia to be one of the only colonised countries in the world that does not recognise Indigenous people in its founding document. The recognition they want is an enshrined voice, meaning it's permanent and can't be removed without another referendum.
I expect the Voice to be an independent, grassroots body that brings the views of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia to the Parliament. That's its job.
Now let's take a look at the No campaign. The Biggest No campaign is backed by the conservative lobby group Advance under the banner of Australians for Unity. Spokespeople include Warren Mundine and Shadow Indigenous Australians Minister Jacinta Nampagimpa-Price.
We're only this far apart. Everyone wants to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the Constitution, but tying it up to this voice where they could have sat down and have a conversation.
Other supporters of the No case include the federal opposition, including Liberal Party leader Peter Dutton and Nationals leader David Littleproud. The No campaign has several different arguments against the Voice to Parliament proposal. They see the voice as divisive and they don't want to see the Constitution changed because they believe it could create the opportunity for legal challenges in the High Court. They also want to see the legislation that would govern the voice before Australia votes on whether to create it.
If Australians have buyer's remorse, the voice comes with a no returns policy. It's here to stay. And yet this institution hasn't even been road tested.
There is also a secondary No movement known as the Progressive No, championed by Independent Senator Lydia Thorpe and the Black Sovereign movement she represents in Parliament.
This is not a new movement. It is just that we have never had a platform nor an audience willing to listen before.
The Progressive No doesn't support the voice, but for very different reasons to the Australians for Unity campaign. They want to see action on treaty ahead of the voice because they believe that process would be more successful in improving the lives of Indigenous Australians. And they believe the voice proposal doesn't go far enough because it will be advisory only and won't have any kind of veto power. So there you have the main reasons both these campaigns will be chasing your vote. Expect to see a lot from both sides as the country heads towards the first referendum in over 20 years.
Let's go to Alice Springs now. Laurie May is a First Nations woman and General Manager of Indigenous Community Television. Hi there, Laurie. So we now officially know the date. How are people feeling there in Alice about this?
I think there's definitely a lot of trepidation around this upcoming vote. It's definitely something that our reporters are seeing and experiencing. We've had journalists going out to remote communities and interviewing people in their first languages, Warlpiri, Pitjantjatjara, Western Arrernte, Yankunytjatjara and Creole. And the response that we've had all year has been that there is not enough information about it and that people would like to know more.
Well, let's hear from some of the people that you have been speaking to.
Parliament kirak ini kami je bin ko je voice we nyamboi na lawa no la na urpana tweet nganda nyambuk voice ngut cuma ken jak Parliament kirak kol kana wangan jak nyarbam ko je we chunde ting jaram. Well, I don't know, it's pretty hard I never realize. Percira me panu ma jambi community anga surrounding ane am Northern Territory panu nya one each anga from every community in Northern Territory.
Jangan koloni was Parliament ni jana ni like anang wanga koloni ngana na yino.
Ngai koloni voice Parliament nya balo jar panjak.
Tan ngana betokor ba tingotan
So, Laurie, that's the common view you found, is it, that people don't know about the voice and that often any information they do receive is in English, that they feel unheard?
Absolutely. So we also haven't been seeing any communication coming across television campaigns in languages other than English as well. So it's not only something that we're hearing directly from people in communities, but it's something that we're also seeing from a campaign perspective here in Mbantua.
Okay, and in terms of the information that is being received there, is there a lot of misinformation or mischief, as Tanya Hosh called it earlier, around your region that's confusing and just wrong?
Absolutely. Social media is one of the primary sources of communication a lot of people in remote communities have direct access to. And so that's where a lot of that disinformation is getting spread. There's a lot of fear-mongering. People that we've spoken to are hearing a lot of reasons why they should vote no. and it is based on misinformation. So that's definitely a huge problem that we're seeing in remote communities.
Right, so how can you as an Indigenous broadcaster then, Laurie, hope to correct that, the misinformation from both the yes and the no camps?
Yeah, we see that as our role in media to educate and inform and support people to make informed decisions. Whether that decision is yes or no, well, we do see it as our role to get those messages across, which is why we've got reporters going to communities directly to people on the ground and asking them what they know, but also, as you see in those vox pops, is that when people respond with that they don't know anything about it, our journalists are trained in the information and tell people what it is. And what we're seeing from that is that once people know what the voice actually is, that then they actually do have an opinion on it. But if people don't know what it is, they're not going to be able to form that opinion.
And do you expect both campaigns to reach out to remote communities to get their message across, Laurie, and how will they do that?
We have been seeing a slight increase in politicians trying to reach out to communities, but there are certainly platforms, obviously, like ICTV, like community radio, like other community broadcasters, that these platforms are available and people can access them to get those messages out to communities. We're seeing a very slight increase, and I mean very slight increase, in the messaging and politicians going out and speaking directly to people.
Laurie, it was interesting what you were saying about once people have had a conversation, they're happy to share their thoughts and take a position. So I wonder, is there a bit of a feeling that the yes and no campaigns just haven't been targeting Central Australia, particularly where you are at Mbantua?
Yeah, exactly. So at the communities that surround Mbantua, we've been heading out to like Gingerporter, Yundamu. We went up to Barunga Festival in July as well. And there definitely is that feeling that the people who this vote is going to affect the most aren't being communicated with.
Yeah, and we heard some of your reporters having conversations in language from Ndaria, from Santa Teresa, from Tichikala as well. I wonder, what are those in the community saying about hearing about the voice to Parliament at first instance in their first language?
Yeah, people are very excited to be able to be communicated with in their first language, of course. I mean, everyone is. And once people kind of understand what it is, there is a very positive sentiment around the idea of it. There is also a lot of distrust against all government, which is understandable from our people's perspective. But there is a lot of genuine, I guess, hope and dreams that this voice has the opportunity to lead to improvements in the everyday life of remote community Territorians.
Yeah, Lauren, that point that you make about distrust is such an interesting one. I've been hearing that from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people everywhere that I've been travelling around the country, that for many there is still a sense of just not trusting the systems of governance and of government. That's clearly partly what you're hearing as well.
Absolutely. There's, we've certainly seen it all firsthand here with things like the, rollout of the intervention that there, and going back 200 years, there is a lot of reasons why First Nations people are distrustful of the government.
Laurie May, look, great to yarn with you. Thanks so much, Laurie May, is the First Nations woman and General Manager of Indigenous Community Television there from Mbantua, Alice Springs. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
The Prime Minister has named the date. Australians will vote on whether to enshrine an Indigenous voice to Parliament in the Constitution. The referendum will take place on October the 14th, so we're going to see 6 weeks of intense campaigning from both sides. Australians will be asked to vote yes or no to the question: a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? In order to pass, a majority of voters nationally must approve it, as well as 4 of the 6 states. The Voice would advise the government on matters affecting Indigenous Australians. The Prime Minister has called on Australians to back the proposal, saying the Voice would improve the lives of Indigenous people across the nation.
My fellow Australians, what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want for their children is what you want for yours. Staying healthy, doing well at school, finding a job they love, being safe and leading fulfilling lives. That's what they are asking you to say yes to at this referendum. The same opportunity for their children to make a good life for themselves. So in a spirit of generosity and optimism, vote yes. In recognition of 65,000 years of history, vote yes. With hope for a better future, vote yes. Vote yes on October 14. Thank you.
Let's bring in ABC data analyst Casey Briggs now, who's been looking at the polls. Casey, talk us through the national figures.
Hi Dan, hi Ros. Yeah, we're monitoring what the polls are saying because they simply are the best gauge we have of national public opinion. And contrary to what people like to sometimes say, including politicians, when it comes to general elections, they're a pretty good guide, with one notable exception, that being the 2019 election. And these are all of the national polls that we have been tracking. The yes vote, sitting at 46% in the most recent Resolve poll. But, earlier in the year, we were seeing much higher numbers. Now, each of these polls individually has a margin of error, has some random variation. The best thing that we can do really is to consider all of them at once, and we get a lot more information by combining these into a single polling average. And when we do that, let me show you what we get. I mean, the trend line is not really of great surprise. We've seen declining support for yes and increasing support for no through the year. And our best estimate is the polls collectively saying that nationally, yes is sitting on about 45.3% according to the poll. So that is, to be clear, about a 9 or more than a 9 percentage point gap between yes and no at this stage. And if the referendum were held today, the polls would have to be out by significantly more than we saw in the 2019 federal election for yes to come out ahead. So I think it's pretty clear, and I think even the Yes campaign would acknowledge this, they are starting this final sprint to the finish on the back foot. Yes has promised that they're going to be intensifying their campaign. They say they've got an army of 30,000 volunteers. I think that's a significant war chest. Let me just show you the last month's spending on the two main Facebook pages from the two campaigns. Yes 23 spending nearly $350,000 in a month. Fair Australia spending something like $20,000. So on just these two Facebook pages, yes, massively outspending no, but of course that's just a sliver of all of the spending that's happening. But I think we can probably conclude yes has more money. The question will be, do they have time to turn this kind of trend around? Because October 14 is not that far away.
No, and certainly now that the date is announced, but they're going to be off and racing, we know, Casey, this referendum will also depend very strongly on state results. So what can you tell us there?
Yeah, so just to recap, to be absolutely clear, there are two conditions for victory in a referendum. One is the national vote, and that's what these polls are measuring. 50% must vote yes for this referendum to succeed. But the other one, of course, is the states' votes. 4 of the 6 states need to vote yes for the referendum to pass. If 3 states vote no, the referendum is defeated. And we don't have as clear a picture of state polling just because the sample sizes are smaller. Normally they're looking, the state polls that are being published are looking at sub-samples of the national polls. But the picture that we are getting out of the states is that New South Wales and Victoria are on the higher end of support for yes, often though still not majority yes, but on the higher end. Queensland and WA on the lower end, and I think a lot of yes campaigners have hopes are fading that they'll win Queensland and WA. So let's just say hypothetically that New South Wales and Victoria go yes and Queensland and WA go no, and you end up with a map that looks a bit like this. The Northern Territory and the ACT don't count toward the state majority condition. They'll count towards the national vote only. And what we're left with is 2-2, and then South Australia and Tasmania, the two smallest states left. And these are actually the states that it's most tricky to get a read on public opinion because they're the smallest states. We have the smallest polling samples. But some polls are showing South Australia looking pretty good for yes. Some of them are showing it a bit more middly. It's a bit unclear, but it tells you a bit about why the Yes 23 campaign has gone, not just to South Australia, but to outer suburban Adelaide to launch this campaign. I think it shows you that's an area that they really want to win.
Yeah, certainly is. Thanks so much there, Casey Briggs. And if you have any questions or simply need to find out any information about the referendum, ABC News has set up a comprehensive resource on our website. Head over to abc.net.au/voice referendum for all of your needs.
Let's go back to Adelaide now, where the Prime Minister made this announcement today. Reporter Stephanie Richards was there and has been travelling around remote South Australia speaking to people about the voice. Hi there, Stephanie. So South Australia was the location chosen for the announcement of the date. How are people feeling about the voice in the state?
Well, Ros, at this event, support is obviously overwhelming, but that's not necessarily the case across the rest of South Australia. As you said, I was recently in Oodnadatta. Now, that's a remote town about 1,000 kilometres north of Adelaide. It's perhaps one of the most isolated places in Australia, and the locals that I spoke to there were saying that they weren't necessarily sure what the voice was. They wanted someone to come and to sit down with them and explain exactly what it was and how it could benefit their remote community. This is what some of the locals told me.
It's only for the town people, town Aboriginal people. It's no good for us, I don't think.
Oh, I'd support it, as long as I see what happens with smaller communities like this here. Not only this place, but other smaller communities that haven't been sort of touched by funding-wise and all that kind of stuff.
I see it on TV being advertised. I see a lot of communities all walking around in T-shirts saying yes, you know, like, what are you saying yes to?
So Stephanie's Casey Briggs was just saying South Australia being seen as something of a swing state. Is that partly why the referendum date announcement was made there?
It is, yeah. South Australia is considered a real crucial battleground state which could make or break the campaign for Yes supporters. Noel Pearson, the architect of the Uluru Statement for the Heart, he was out saying that he considers South Australia to be the most important state, a state that really could set the tone for the rest of the country when it comes to voting. Now, as Casey would have said earlier, South Australia is one of those crucial states because it is a smaller state, and we know that for the referendum to get up, the government needs to win the support of the majority of voters nationally, but also the majority of voters in at least 4 states. And so that means that for smaller states like South Australia, each vote carries a lot more traction with it. So we know that, you know, there's been people, both campaigns, Yes and the No campaign, have been looking closely at South Australia, and that's one of the reasons why this event, this announcement to launch the referendum date was made in South Australia, and it really sends a signal to the rest of the country that the government does have its eyes on South Australia. We heard during this event, Peter Malinauskas was going through some of the history of social reforms in South Australia. This state was the first state to enact Aboriginal land rights legislation in 1966. It was the first state to establish a state-based voice to Parliament. That was just in March this year. It was also one of the leading states to recognise women and to allow women to have the right to vote. So really, all eyes are on South Australia for this referendum.
I'm here today because I'm a proud signatory to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Being involved in this process as a young person, as a proud Adyamat and Nguga the young man, I think, you know, at the end of the day, 6 years ago, we delivered the invitation to the Australian people to come on a journey with us for constitutional reform.
Too long Aboriginal people haven't been given the recognition and respect that they deserve, and we really need to get them into the Constitution so that they're acknowledged as the first people in this land. For 65,000 years they've been here, and they've been overlooked, ignored.
We're here today to get people on board
There seems to be a lot of misinformation in our community about people not knowing. Simply just ask. Not recognising our mobs in the Constitution is a small step forward. It's a major step back for us, and we want to be recognised and acknowledged.
Stephanie, to get very local, what are people saying about their voice there in Elizabeth, the suburb where the date was announced?
Well, I've spoken to a few locals at this event today, and they are saying that they obviously are in support being an event like this, but they say that it's not all the case across the rest of the suburb. There is a lot of polarising views about whether some people support or some people don't support. Now, it's interesting that this event was launched in Elizabeth. Elizabeth is an outer suburb of Adelaide. It's traditionally a working class suburb. It does have a higher population of First Nations people compared to the rest of Adelaide, and it's also a multicultural suburb with a lot of migrants and refugees who live here. And having this event here really sends a signal that the government is looking to tap into those suburban votes. We had Noel Pearson out earlier saying that, you know, the Yes campaign didn't want to launch their campaign at a celebrity endorse event. They wanted to be seen among the so-called ordinary Australians and to be seen to be out in the communities where there may be undecided voters in a bid to swing their vote.
Stephanie, thank you.
Well, let's get more now on the politics of The Voice. Host of Insiders, David Spears, joins us from Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome, David. We heard from the Electoral Commissioner, Tom Rogers, earlier, and he described comments from the No campaigner, Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, although he didn't mention him by name, talking about that ticks and crosses on the ballot paper. Let's have a listen to what Tom Rogers had to say.
There has been some misinformation about the voting process over the last week. I'm really urging everyone to write yes or no in full on the ballot paper, and that way you can make sure your vote actually counts. I'm even nervous talking about it because every time I say it, it inflames an issue that's a non-issue even further. I just urge people, please, if you want your vote to count, write either yes or no. But like at every election, for over a century, there are certain provisions in the Act which enable the AEC, enable the electoral authorities, watched by scrutineers, to give effect to the choice of voters. And so there's been some discussions about the issue of ticks and crosses. Again, we put out a media statement last week. I don't want to add to it because it's further inflaming it. Please write yes or no to make sure that your vote will count.
David, so Tom Rogers there saying that there was some misinformation, quite a strong statement. That, of course, comes off the back of last week, that statement where it said the AEC completely and utterly rejects the suggestions by some that by transparently following the established public and known legislative requirements were undermining the impartiality and fairness of the referendum. This is a strong statement from the Commissioner today.
Yeah, although he's being very cautious today compared to his initial comments about how ticks and crosses might be counted. There, he wouldn't really go into it at all. You're right, a strong word to say there's misinformation being spread, and while not naming Peter Dutton, clearly it was the opposition leader's reference to all of this being a rigged process that the Electoral Commission is responding to there. But he's not venturing a view right there in those comments about how ticks or crosses might be counted. Just write yes or no. That way you can make sure your vote will be counted. There are those savings provisions. He did last week talk about a tick would be counted as yes, a cross, more ambiguous, wouldn't be counted as a no. That is in line with AEC practice for 30 years, as they've pointed out. Nothing's changed. There was an opportunity when the legislation was debated earlier this year, the Referendum Machinery Act, to object to that, to change that. That didn't come up. It has only come up in the last week, but I don't think this is something that's going to be a sustained issue. It feels more like an issue that ran for a few days and then sort of goes away. We'll see. But, the Electoral Commissioner not wanting to reopen that can of worms again today by simply saying, please, just write yes or no.
David, the starting gun then has now fired. How do you see the campaigns rolling out from here? What will be the tenor of the campaigns and how robust do you expect them to be?
Oh, look, I think it's going to be pretty robust. I mean, if the first half of this year is any guide, we're in for quite a heated debate over the next 6 weeks. I do think the Prime Minister's opening speech that we saw there in Elizabeth was a very positive pitch. it was really trying to, wipe away the complexity or confusion around this question. He kept saying it's simple, it's straightforward. He went through it line by line, the question and the proposed alteration of the Constitution. It's simple, it's straightforward. That, I think, will be something we hear a lot from the Prime Minister and other yes campaigners. He didn't get into rebutting the various no campaign arguments around this, dragging down the debate into those areas. He didn't really get stuck into the no campaign too much, other than saying, please don't close the door on this opportunity and stick with the status quo. So look, it was a positive opening message from the Prime Minister, but I do think what we've witnessed over recent months tells us this is going to be a heated campaign. There's so much at stake. There's so much at stake for Indigenous Australians and the advancement of Indigenous Australians, for recognition, for reconciliation. There's a lot at stake politically as well. Whichever way this goes, the political ramifications will be felt right through to the next election and beyond. So for all those reasons, there will be a lot of heat in this campaign, but at least that opening pitch there was positive.
Yeah, and we've heard from so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people this year, David, that it feels as though our existence is up for debate on the sidelines of this. Of course, that's not the question we'll be voting on, but there's a bigger conversation happening here. And I suspect that part of the reason that the announcement was made in Adelaide in South Australia was because it's seen as one of those key swing states together with Tasmania. So how crucial do you think it's going to be for the campaigns to be focusing on those two jurisdictions?
Look, really important, and the No campaign will hear from Hobart, and they're in Tasmania for the same reason that the Yes campaign's in South Australia. These two smallest states are arguably the most decisive states in this. It's worth just pointing out how different a referendum campaign is from an election campaign. We haven't had one for more than 2 decades, and they are quite different. I think even the Prime Minister made that point himself in his opening speech. They're very different. Don't expect the campaign buses rolling around marginal seats for 6 weeks as we see in an election contest. It's not about marginal seats, it's about marginal states. I mean, where they were today in Elizabeth, very safe Labor territory in terms of the seat, but that state is in play. Now, the Yes campaign are pretty confident about New South Wales and Victoria. They're not very confident, they're not confident at all about Queensland. A little bit, they reckon WA still might be a possibility for them. But it's South Australia and Tasmania that are the key here. You've got to win 4 states to win this. Don't forget a double majority we're talking about. You've got to win the national vote, and you've got to win a majority in 4 states. So if the Yes case gets New South Wales and Victoria, they then need Tasmania and South Australia. So you'll see a lot of both sides focused on those 2 small states. There are other differences too from an election campaign, and that's why all the polling we've seen to date might not matter as much. What we'll see in the coming weeks is going to matter a lot more. Referendums, you don't go in with the baggage of your traditional vote being Labor or Liberal or whatever it is. You're not voting on a person or a party, as the PM said today. You're voting on an idea, on a question. Yes, the partisan divide over this question will have an influence, but not as much as during an election when you're voting on whether to put one side or the other into government. So there are all sorts of differences. You're not going to get the daily policy announcements and promises. We know what this question's about. It's now just about reaching those who haven't made up their mind or haven't paid attention to this and building momentum. That momentum issue is going to be really important for the next 6 weeks.
On that point you were just making, David, we had the rather unusual sight of Penny Wong and Julie Bishop walking along the streets of Perth earlier this week, campaigning together for a yes vote. Can we expect to see more cross-party collusion or togetherness like this in the weeks ahead? It sounds like the answer is yes.
Yeah, yes, it will be. I mean, this morning, Malcolm Turnbull and Tanya Plibersek doing an event this morning. You'll see Greens, you'll see independent MPs joining up with those on the Labor side. Look, there's a limited number, it must be said, on the Liberal side who are willing to do these sorts of events. You'll see Julie and Lisa, Bridget Archer, and the 2 former Deputy Leader Turnbull and Bishop that you mentioned there. But beyond that, I don't think you'll see a great deal from the Liberal or National Party side, but some of it. And that's another difference to what you'd see in an election campaign as well. For the Yes case, they need to show this is not a partisan thing. This has broad support beyond just Labor. This has support, across the aisle. So whenever they get the opportunity to show that, they will.
David, I wonder if people will be seeing politics and politicians in a different light as this process rolls on, keeping in mind what you just said about this not being a regular election campaign.
Yeah, I mean, look, the leaders will always command much of the attention. Whatever Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton do every day, as you guys know, it's something the media follows, not just mainstream media, but social media. Everything will follow what those two leaders do. But this referendum is about more than politicians. Other voices will matter, will have an influence. You saw that with the launch, a deliberate effort there, not to just have politicians front and centre, and that will be the task for the coming 6 weeks as well. How much, media, national attention they will gain, who knows? But that is another difference here, that we're going to hear more from other voices. What'll be interesting, I think, is around grand finals time for the NRL and AFL, what we hear from various individuals and the codes in terms of their support for the yes case. I mean, the faith groups, the community groups, the business organisations that the Prime Minister pointed to this morning in that opening speech. It will be interesting to see what role they play in steering this debate too.
And David, just finally, this is such an important moment for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as the nuts and bolts of the referendum, the yes and no campaigns. Is that sense of importance, emotion, significance, is it cutting through? And do you think it will?
Yes, I do. I think it will. I mean, you can't separate, you can't divorce that, that issue about how we view Indigenous Australians from this particular question about whether we enshrine a voice in the Constitution. And that means that the No campaign will face ongoing questions about what's the alternative. Is it sticking with the status quo, which clearly, looking at any close the gap target over recent years shows isn't working. So what is the alternative? And that's where it gets a bit muddier in terms of would Peter Dutton legislate a voice? What would it look like? A national voice, regional voices? What would they do in terms of constitutional recognition if not this option? So yeah, there will be focus. There needs to be focus on the alternative here if Australia chooses not to go down the path of what's been put on the table this morning.
Thanks so much, David. You can watch tonight's Insider's Voice campaign special with No campaigner Warren Mundine and South Australian Premier Peter Malinauskas at 8 p.m. Eastern on the News Channel or on ABC iView. Well, let's get some more reaction from around the country now. Dwes Wingen Dan is a queer rights advocate in the Kimberley town of Kununurra and will be voting yes at the upcoming referendum. He says the voice will give First Nations people a greater say in policy making.
We know our lives, we know what happens, we know the details of, how to, address social issues within our communities, but we've never been given that permission to actually have a say actively. And, I think we've always been at the mercy of successive governments to make those changes for us. But I think now's the time that we need to make those changes for our own selves.
Taylor Gray is a Wiradjuri woman, lawyer and a PhD candidate focusing on native title rights. She's still undecided about how she'll be voting in the referendum.
I don't think I'm in any rush at this point to reach a decision. And I'm carefully considering the pros and cons of the advisory, of this voice to Parliament. But even with the date approaching fastly, I will not be rushed in my deliberation. But I think, again, talking to my elders, talking to the grassroots movements, and talking, to people generally in the public. When I was travelling just recently back from the Gama Festival, and there's a lot of misconceptions around the voice. I mean, one thing that arose out of my trip from in the cab ride to the airport was that with the advisory voice to Parliament, it's going to steal all of everybody's land. So there's misconceptions around that, and that's definitely not the case.
Taylor Gray there speaking to us earlier. Well, the votes of Australia's many migrant communities will be key to the success or failure of the Voice referendum, particularly in the most populous states. Some, like Canberra's Chinese community, have chosen to campaign directly for a yes vote, but not all multicultural communities are doing the same.
On Ngunnawal country, Indian expats enjoy a national pastime. A spell at the crease, interest rates and the cost of living are front of mind, while debate on the voice is still filtering through.
I'm not involved into any of this stuff, so you're asking the wrong person.
I have got no idea about that, sorry.
I'll be voting yes for it, yeah. Because I believe they're the First Nations people of this country and the country belongs to them.
First Nations sporting icons and grassroots campaigners are delivering the Yes 23 pitch.
This is the first time we're getting an opportunity to acknowledge the real traditional land
holders, custodians.
Style, yes, but perhaps substance, no, for Canberra's 20,000 strong Indian community.
Few of my friends, few of the community leaders are asking the same question, that exactly what we are voting for.
Australians for Unity is leaning on the power of social media algorithms to be heard.
Because this will not unite us, this will divide us.
A message not believed by many in the capital's Chinese community.
We don't want to make the voice of the parliament as a racial thing. We want to make the voice of the parliament as to treat everybody equal.
21 community organisations represent Canberra's 26,000 Chinese Australians. Those organisations will back the Yes campaign.
We vote to support our First Nation people, and that is the message we want to get across.
Canberra's 30 Indian community groups represent the diversity of the world's most populous nation, but community leaders won't tell them which way to vote.
We let individuals make the decisions. We don't necessarily promote yes or no.
James Viver, ABC News, Canberra.
Queensland is shaping up to be one of the most polarising states in the country. Confusion over how a voice to Parliament would work and how it would bring about meaningful change has been at the front of discussions. Reporter Brittany Klein is in Brisbane and joins us now live. Hi there, Brittany. So Queensland has been previously described as ground zero in the upcoming vote, and we understand that the government campaign is heading to Queensland next. Why is it so important?
Yeah, well, Ros, we know that this referendum needs the support of 4 of the 6 states. And so given the growing no sentiment in Queensland, this state could really be a barrier to the referendum's success. Major polling has shown that, like I said, the no sentiment is very loud in Queensland, with the Yes campaign support for the Yes campaign well below 50%. But perhaps we shouldn't see that as a surprise, given the conservative history of Queensland. We're lagging in abortion rights. It's always been a hard no amongst voters when it comes to daylight savings. And in the 1999 referendum, Queensland voters returned the highest no vote right across the country. But over the last couple of days, I've been out in Brisbane's outer suburbs like Ipswich, just speaking anecdotally with voters. And I think the largest percentage of voters are actually apathetic towards this referendum. Many speak to me saying they haven't yet decided, or they haven't really entered into the debate about whether they'll vote yes or no. Many citing that they don't feel like either case has really presented them with enough information to make an informed vote. Many say that they hope to see that over the next 6 weeks. And as we know, the countdown now begins to October 14. So many of those voters may see those answers that they were looking for. And no doubt we will see both the Yes and No campaign, like you spoke about, heading to Queensland. Speaking of, Senator Murray Watt and Queensland Minister for Treaty and Aboriginal Partnerships, Leanne Enoch, have actually scheduled a press conference for this afternoon, no doubt amping up the Yes campaign here in Queensland.
Brittany, historically there has at times been a bit of a city-country divide among Queenslanders politically. Is that tipped to be the case again here?
Yeah, well, Ros, we always see this city-country divide at the Queensland ballot box simply because the issues that are affecting regional Queenslanders, particularly in the north of the state, they vary a lot to those in the southeast Queensland corner, particularly in metropolitan areas like the Queensland capital, Brisbane, the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast. That polling that we talked about that talks about this loud growing no sentiment in Queensland, it's actually even louder at the moment in regional areas. So like I said, whether we'll actually see that is hypothetical at the moment as we head towards October 14. But we are hearing that both the Yes and No campaign will be not only centring their campaigns here in Brisbane and metropolitan areas, but also in regional centres as well. In the last month, we saw Elder Noel Pearson, who is also an architect of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. He was here calling Queensland ground zero. So like you said, Ross, I think it's no doubt that we'll see both the Yes and the No campaigns heading to Queenslanders to get voters on side.
Brittany, thank you.
Meanwhile, in Victoria, a majority of people have indicated they will still back the Voice. It's prompted speculation that those campaigning against it may bypass the state and focus their attentions elsewhere. Reporter Natalie Whiting joins us from Melbourne. Natalie, what can we expect to see in Victoria in the weeks leading up to the referendum?
Well, as you mentioned there, the recent polling has shown that a majority of Victorians do still support the voice. Obviously, that polling has shown support dropping off across most of Australia, with no pulling ahead in some key states. But here in Victoria, the majority are still supporting it. And so because of that, there's potential that we won't see as much campaigning focused on the state. There have already been some prominent campaigners for the No campaign who have said that they likely won't need Victoria and that they will focus on other states, saying that perhaps the chances of convincing people here mightn't be as simple. There's been some of the No campaigners saying that their time may be better spent elsewhere. So it could be that we see less of the campaign focus here in Victoria based on that recent polling.
So what's been the response there to the date being announced in the last couple of hours?
Well, Jez, we've had some reporters out on the street speaking to people. We're getting, obviously, as there is the case across the country, there are people for and against the voice. There's also people wanting more information and interested to hear more from the campaigns. Here's a little of what some of the people out on the streets here in Melbourne had to say following the announcement of the date.
I'm not sold yet on either stance. I tend to try and gather as much data around the point before I make a decision. It feels like right now there's a lot of questioning being done against the vote.
I feel they're gonna it would be good for their development and everything if they have one representative and who can represent their voice, their needs and everything. So I think it's a good opportunity.
I reckon I'll vote yes, just because I think it's about time giving equal rights. There shouldn't be any discrimination, all that stuff.
And there's been debate about whether the voice will lead to a national treaty. Is that a discussion, though, that's already happening in Victoria?
Yeah, it certainly is, Dan. I think I might have actually called you Jez earlier. Sorry, I'm too used to speaking to your colleague. A high compliment. But yes, you're right, Dan. There has been discussion of treaty. It's already well advanced here in Victoria. We actually have a First Nations People Assembly that's already, we've had it's sitting for 4 years. We've just had elections for the new group of representatives for that assembly. So there is already something of a voice to the state parliament here in Victoria, and the focus of that group is on negotiating treaty with the state government. So as I say, the framework around that's already been worked on. Discussions are getting underway in terms of a local treaty, and that does have bipartisan support here in Victoria. It'll be interesting to see if that is looked at as these sort of discussions are happening nationally. So it's interesting that that has got bipartisan support. At the moment, the Premier here, Daniel Andrews, has supported the voice, but the opposition leader, John Pesutto, he's yet to give his position. But opposition Liberal MPs in Victoria are being given a chance to vote whichever way they would please. So we're still waiting to hear what the opposition leader thinks. He's indicated he may give more detail as to what way he's voting closer to the date. But as I've said, the Premier, Daniel Andrews, is supporting it. Here's what he had to say this morning ahead of the date being announced.
We have tried one way for a long time, telling Aboriginal people what's best for them and how to improve their lives, save their lives, and that's not working. That system is broken. It's failing everybody.
So that was the Premier, Daniel Andrews, here this morning. Obviously support from him, and as I say, Liberal MPs here are being given a chance to vote whichever way they please. The majority of state MPs that have announced their position from the Liberal side have said no, but there has been at least one publicly saying yes. We'll wait to see where the politics go locally here in Victoria and what impact that may have on the referendum campaign in Victoria.
Natalie Whiting reporting from Melbourne.
So just recapping our breaking news, the Prime Minister has named the date Australians will vote on whether to enshrine an Indigenous voice to Parliament in the Constitution. The referendum will take place on October the 14th, so we're going to see 6 weeks of intense campaigning from both sides. Australians will be asked to vote yes or no to the question, a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? So in order to pass, a majority of voters nationally must approve it, as well as 4 of the 6 states. And the Voice would advise the government on matters affecting Indigenous Australians. This is where viewers on ABC TV are leaving us. You can continue watching our special coverage of the Voice to Parliament on the ABC News channel. We are expecting to hear from No campaigners shortly. We're waiting for Warren Mundine in particular to join us from Hobart. Lots more to come.
Well, let's get more on what people in remote communities are saying about the Voice to Parliament. Natalie Davey from Fitzroy Crossing in Western Australia is a Wangi radio broadcaster and joins us now. Welcome back to the program.
Howdy, Dan. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
Hey, tell me, has the conversation ramped up there? Because the last time that you and I spoke a couple of months ago when I was there in your community, it wasn't really rating a mention.
Well, we had a lot going on at your last visit. We're still in the process of flood recovery. There is the conversation been happening around the referendum. I think there is a whole cohort of people that the conversation hasn't been brought to them yet. So it is a matter of still creating safe spaces to bring that conversation to them and go through it with them in a straightforward way.
And who's leading that? Is that the campaigners? Are they coming into the community and having those conversations?
Well, we've had the Kimberley Land Council do a referendum roadshow, go around to 4 major towns in the Kimberley to talk about the yes vote. I'm unsure about the no vote campaigners at this point. And I think it's doing a bit of a disservice in the sense of you're either in one or the other camp, and we haven't created those spaces or enough of those spaces that are safe and appropriate to talk to people in a straightforward manner what the Voice to Parliament actually means.
And you touched on this at the start of this discussion, Natalie, and when we were there, when I was there, you were talking to me about the flood recovery and you could see it. The devastation was clear to see. The main road was washed out. There was a barge in place. Many homes were needing to be destroyed. How's the recovery going?
It's slow. It is going to be long term. It is a matter of similar to the Voice. It's the keeping that conversation going and being able to contribute to how that recovery looks. And it is going to be years in that recovery. So it's a day by day thing, but things are plodding along, as you say.
And one of the other things that we've been hearing about today is about some communities, particularly remote Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory, not getting information about the campaigns in first languages. What's the experience there where you are?
Oh, well, it's exactly the same, but it's also that whole point of having safe and appropriate. So that means in, the languages of the region. For example, here in Fitzroy, it would be the people who are trusted that have that information going out and talking to families. If we were having like a Dangu, which is my clan group meeting, being able to discuss that amongst us. A lot of people, my first language is Kimberley Creole, so having meetings in the language of who you're speaking to is a massive part of being able to get the information through so people can decide for themselves. I mean, you get the whole spectrum of people, but just putting it into a yes or no campaign, I think that takes away from like you brought up before, that it is as simple as do you agree or disagree with establishing a entity to inform government.
And we've been hearing in many parts of the country about a deterioration of the tone of the debate, and some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people speaking to how they feel and how this is, in some instances, doing damage, this campaign. What's the experience in Fitzroy Crossing?
Well, yeah, we have that as well. And I think a lot of that comes from fear and the practice of not being, or the feeling of not being heard in these spaces. So it does trigger, and if you're going to be triggered, you react in, the trauma responses. So you're either attacking, or you're shutting down and not listening, or you're building walls, all of those kind of things. And that's why I think the whole point of having safe and appropriate spaces to go through it straightforward makes sense, because it's just muttering.
Thank you, Sarah. Sorry, I have to jump in there. Natalie Davey from Fitzroy Crossing, Wangi Radio broadcaster. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're taking you live to Hobart now. Sorry.
We're excited about it. Go on.
Where the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, is speaking.
The lines of race within our nation's rule book. Do we divide our country? Within our constitution. The Prime Minister is suggesting that this is the only way forward to support our most marginalised Indigenous Australians. At no point did he actually make reference to Indigenous Australians who he claims this proposal is supposed to support going forward. He made reference to corporates, he made reference to community groups, to faith groups, but he didn't make reference to the people that I represent in my constituency, some of our most marginalised Indigenous Australians. It is evident to me that this elite proposal is about division in our country. And it is that old rule of divide and conquer that I can't stand for. I'm not going to allow a line to run straight through the middle of my family within our constitution. I don't expect that to take place within our country, to be treating Indigenous Australians differently to the rest of Australia because of our racial heritage. There's so many times the Prime Minister references the referendum of 1967. That referendum came about with overwhelming support from Australians to bring about equality in our country for Indigenous people through equality of citizenship, through education, through access to opportunity. Like all other Australians, we have created equality in this country. It is wrong to suggest we have not had a voice. Voices like mine, elected parliamentarians, voices like my good friend Warren Mundine, are speaking up. We are telling this Prime Minister our voices are relevant. The voices of those Indigenous people in this country that we represent who do not support this, who did not participate in the Uluru dialogues, have spoken up. The Prime Minister is effectively ignoring us. So to suggest that we have not had a voice is completely and utterly misleading. And we will not allow for the Prime Minister and this referendum to divide our country along the lines of race within our constitution.
Thank you. Jacinta's right. This thing is about division and dividing this country and the racial abuse that we've been hearing over the last few months. Everyone knows the pressure that was put on me to send me almost to suicidal positions. And this is what this Prime Minister has done. This Prime Minister from day one had attacked people who had a different opinion to him, called them names, and that opened up the floor for the whole division to start, with all the horrible racial abuse, with all the horrible bigotry that's been going on out there, and it's all Albo. He's the one who started this. He's the one who's brought it out. And if he thinks that the voice is the answer to fixing everything, this magic wand, then he's not answering the real question. The real question is out there is about how do we help people who are in tremendous problems in Aboriginal communities out there. And what's his answer? We're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, which could be better spent in those communities, and him flying around the country with his happy clapping crowd, which is not going to do anything for these people. I'm very angry about this because I and my family grew up under the segregation laws in the 1950s and 60s. We know what it was like. And this is what they're going. We fought for equality. We fought to be treated the same as every other Australian, whether they're here in 5 minutes or they're here for the 160,000 years or whatever it is the number is going to be next week. We are here about building a liberal democracy of freedoms and liberties and equality, not dividing our nation by race. And I will swear on my mother and father's grave that I will fight this, and I'll be out there every day champion the wonderful country that we got, which is not a racist group of people. We're not a racist country with all these elite corporate people and football codes and everyone say we are. And we've got a wonderful, gorgeous country, and we're heading in the right direction. No more division. We are out there to crush this division.
Take a few questions now, guys.
If you're someone who says they want to improve the lives of Aboriginal people but intend to vote no like you guys, what can they do to make a tangible difference, you know, moving forward?
Well, firstly, by voting no to dividing our country along the lines of race and relegating Indigenous Australians to an unknown, detailless, risky and permanent entity. This is not how you solve problems for Indigenous Australians. The Prime Minister has failed to actually provide any evidence whatsoever that demonstrates how it will improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. What we need to do is get our hands dirty and do what actually has not been done. A bloated bureaucracy has been done time and time again. To suggest to put it in our constitution makes it magically effective is wrong. What we haven't done is we haven't looked into where the billions of dollars are being spent year in, year out to determine how they can be better spent, to determine who has been misspending the money and apply real accountability to that. We haven't worked to fix the structures that currently exist, the organisations that currently exist that have the responsibility to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. And it's certainly my job as an elected parliamentarian to do that. I've kicked this process off with my good friend and colleague, Senator Karen Little, to call for an inquiry into land councils, statutory authorities, Aboriginal organisations that are federally funded to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. That's how we begin to fix the problems.
Exactly, and there's only one word that we need that can fix the entire problem, and that's accountability. They have been spending $33 billion annually on Aboriginal affairs. I went and did some of the sums over the last 50 years of the money spent, and it's nearly $1 trillion. The question has got to be asked, what have you done with that money? If I had $1 trillion, we could fix the problems within Aboriginal communities today. But no, these people are spending all this money. They've got to be held accountable for it. You know, and for the last 12 months since this government's come to power, what have they done? All they talked about is the voice. You know, that is not going to fix the problems on the ground. Albo and the Minister for Indigenous Australians were dragged by you blokes, kicking and screaming, to Alice Springs to deal with the issues up there, and he spent less time there than he did at the tennis drinking beer. These blokes we do not trust. We do not trust what they're saying, and they are going to divide. Well, they're not going to divide it. They divided this country already, on racial lines and on bigotry.
There's data showing that people who support the no side will avoid voting altogether. How concerned are you about low voter turnouts?
Well, look, we're encouraging all Australians to participate because the Constitution belongs to each and every Australian. As part of the No campaign, I've been getting out there, Warren's been getting out there, we've been before audiences right across the country, and the audiences that have turned up to our events have been huge. So it's demonstrated to us that there has been a great turnout for those who want to maintain equality in this country, and we're encouraging those people to ensure that they're having the conversations with their family members, that they are informed and that they are participating in this very important decision to amend our constitution, and will continue to do so up until referendum day.
You're in Hobart right now. Why are you seeing Tasmania as an important place to campaign?
Well, as part of our strategy with the No campaign, we've been focusing on the battleground states that we know, are likely to be able to be swayed to provide a no vote toward the referendum. And Tasmania is one of those states, and as recent polling suggests, Tasmania is now trending toward the no. So we're very pleased with that, because we know that our hard work has been paying off. The fact that also Australians are becoming more informed with this debate, and that's I think a really important point, is that when Australians do some research and look further into this and don't just take the Prime Minister's words on face value, they are more likely actually to turn their votes to no.
Yeah. You have to look at social media to see the varied reasons why people are voting yes or no. Is there any level of discomfort that you're on the same side of the debate with people who do hold bigoted views? Is there any level of discomfort there? And what would you say to those people who are not coming at this in good faith and are voting no for backward reasons?
Well, I've always said from day one, the Prime Minister, stop abusing people, stop attacking people. Noel Pearson, who racially abused me in the Australian newspaper, they've got to stop that. And I've always said that the Prime Minister needs to sit down with the with the Leader of the Opposition, come together and actually say to the Australian public, bigotry, racial abuse, lies and distortions should not be said out there. We should have, the Yes campaign should be able to prosecute their case. We should be able to prosecute that case in a mature, sensible, democracy way.
Absolutely. And look, that bigotry has come thick and fast. We've been subjected to that from Yes campaigners. It was only just on Monday when our good colleague Tony Passon's office had an individual come into that office and verbally abuse his staff, as well as a 15-year-old kid who was there doing work experience, and wrecked the office in throwing pamphlets all over the floor. We have been from the get-go asking for respectful debate going forward. We should always have the opportunity to have respectful debate on any issue in our nation. People like myself and Warren shouldn't have to be subjected to racial vilification by anybody, and that goes both ways. Yeah, there are Indigenous people in this country who will racially vilify white people. As we know, there's white people that racially vilify Aboriginal people. We're asking everybody to be respectful.
2 more questions, guys.
Would you work alongside the government if the Yes campaign does come to fruition?
We will always fight. Well, I will always fight for closing that gap. I've been doing it. My lifetime has been spent on it. I've got a track record of doing things, employing things. I'm one of the largest Indigenous employers in the country. And I work for a company like FMG, which is the largest employer of Aboriginal people in the country, getting them trades, jobs, education, building a safe and better future for them. So our track record is quite clear. We will continue to do that. We will continue to work for reconciliation. This silly idea that reconciliation finishes if the No campaign gets up is just nonsense.
With Tasmania as a key battleground, have you spoken to the Tasmanian Premier, the only Liberal Premier in Australia who is supporting the Yes campaign? Have you spoken to him at all?
I have invited my Tasmanian colleagues to come and be part of and come and attend some of the events that we've had here. The invitations have gone out. They've not expressed any sort of enthusiasm to have any conversations or those sorts of things. I think it's important, that they should also speak to members of their Indigenous community here. I know that I've had engagements with members of the Indigenous community here. The Circle Head organisation, which is in Smithton in the north here, have expressed very loudly that they're not in support. Obviously, you've got Michael Mansell, who's another Indigenous person, who doesn't support this going forward. I would hope to think that all parliamentarians that come from Tasmania are having those conversations with the Indigenous members of the community that don't support this proposal going forward.
And I'll tell you how good we are. Last night I was in Brisbane and I went down to Beenleigh, and on the stage with me was Julia Lisa, who is Liberal and is pro-voice, and me. And we had an amazing discussion and conversation. And the people in the audience, the several hundred people in that audience, they can now go away and after listening to both sides and do that. Father Frank Brennan, as you know, is the constitutional lawyer, Jesuit, son of the Chief Justice Brennan, and we've shared 2 stages together. He's prosecuted the Yes campaign, I prosecuted the No campaign. Civil, decent conversations. We got a track record of doing that.
And that's what we will maintain.
And we'll keep on doing that. Every event that we have, we invite them, the Yes campaign, to come and stand and prosecute their case.
Thank you, guys. That's all for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that was a Shadow Indigenous Australian Minister Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price alongside Nyungai Warren Mundine, a spokesperson for the No campaign group Australians for Unity. Very strong words from Warren Mundine there, in particular against the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, saying the referendum will and is dividing the country. So this is effectively the launch of the No campaign against the referendum for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. We had the announcement a couple of hours ago that the date for that referendum will be October the 14th. And insider host David Spears was saying to expect robust campaigns, and that's what we're getting even at this very early stage. Dan, have you heard Warren Mundine speak in these strong terms before?
I think that's probably the most impassioned that I've seen Warren Mundine speak, and I've been on the receiving end of some of his views, particularly on the drum, where he accused me of being a Yes campaigner because of my body language, and then retracted that on social media. Clearly, Warren there was, he said that he is angry in that presentation there, that speech. He says that he is worried about the divisions. He touched on his own mental health, and that's been really well documented and talked about across the media after he did an interview on Sky News where the journalist Matt Cunningham pushed him. It wasn't as though he wanted to speak about that. That was pushed to explore how he was going with that. But there was a lot in that, and certainly when we hear Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price saying that we all need to be respectful, and there is a legitimate concern that this debate is having a detrimental impact, a negative impact on some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As I've been travelling around, Ros, I'm hearing so many people saying that they don't want to speak publicly. They're happy to talk to me privately about their views. They don't want to speak publicly on both the yes and the no side because they're worried about the implications, ramifications, if they take a public position. And it's very concerning because that's not how we navigate political policy matters in Australia with that the types of language that those people are experiencing, or the circumstances that Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price was speaking about just then.
So this was the first event of the No campaign, a real shot across the bows of the Yes campaign. How do you think the Yes campaign is going to respond?
Well, their policy so far has been not to respond on individual components. I suspect there will be some of the elements there that were said about the Prime Minister that the government will want to respond publicly to, that they will absolutely refute that comment that the Prime Minister is doing damage, and they will want to challenge that very strongly. But the Yes campaign has made a real policy position of not getting into the weeds on every perspective, everything that's raised. I do think it's interesting that Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price and Warren Mundine were in Tasmania. That is one of the key states that both sides are looking at. We know that the government spent most of the start of this week in Western Australia, have now spent today in South Australia, and are heading to Queensland tomorrow. So we're seeing a real map there of the 4 jurisdictions that are really strongly in play here from both campaigns, and I suspect that we'll be seeing the No side continuing what they're saying in some of those jurisdictions as well.
Let's bring in reporter Dana Morse now, who is in Adelaide. Hi, Dana. You were there for the announcement. Take us through what the Prime Minister had to say.
Yeah, good afternoon, Ros. It looks very different in here at the Playford Civic Centre in Elizabeth in Adelaide's northern suburbs than it did just over an hour ago. In fact, if you had a look around this room now, you'd hardly know that there was history being made here earlier today. But that's exactly what has been happening. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, making the historic announcement of calling the referendum for the 14th of October. This has been such a long-awaited announcement, of course, since the Prime Minister Minister was elected 15 months ago and promised to deliver the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. The challenge is now down for both campaigns to be educating people on this proposal because, of course, we know that the awareness in the community is still relatively low for something that we've been talking about for such a long time and, of course, that campaigners have been pushing for many, many years. Now, the Prime Minister used his speech today announcing that date as a call to arms and a call to action. He referenced the long history, particularly here in South Australia, of being the firsts to do things and to see things through. But take a listen to what the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, had to say on stage earlier today.
My fellow Australians, what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want for their children is what you want for yours. Staying healthy, doing well at school, finding a job they love, being safe and leading fulfilling lives. That's what they are asking you to say yes to at this referendum. The same opportunity for their children to make a good life for themselves.
So what will the next 6 weeks look like, Dana?
Well, that's the question on everybody's lips, Ros, because we're not quite sure whether a referendum campaign will play out in the same way that we see federal election campaigns. Of course, in that situation, you're looking to win a number of different electorates, but it's a much broader brush that you take to the country in terms of a referendum, because, of course, you need that double majority in order for this to succeed. That means both winning over the majority of the population and at least 4 of the 6 states. Now, that's a very high bar to clear. Very few proposals do it. And of course, the No campaign start this really from an easier position because they only need to get no's from 3 of the 6 states over the line in order to block this proposal from going through. Now, we already know that the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, sees South Australia as a key state in this campaign. He's referenced yesterday that he thinks he'll be coming back to South Australia quite a bit, and he's most likely hoping there that a show of his support here will pay off come polling day. We also know, I spoke earlier today with the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney. She indicated to me that Queensland is next on the agenda for a visit. So we think what we'll see is politicians and campaigners over the next 6 weeks traversing the country trying to pick up the votes that they need to get their proposals over the line. Of course, in between sitting weeks of Parliament as well. So we expect there'll be a little bit of a transfer from politicians over to campaign leaders because they've got other parts of their job that they need to be doing in between all of this.
Thanks, Dana.
Well, Tasmania, as you've heard, is another state which is expected to decide the fate of this year's referendum. However, recent polls have shown that the state is leaning more towards a no vote. Reporter Selena Ross has more from Hobart. Selena, we've just heard from leading campaigners Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, the Shadow Indigenous Australians Minister, and Nungai Warren Mundine. Just talk us through what jumped out from what they had to say to you.
So they were really strongly putting that no campaign forward. I mean, the fact they're even here today in Hobart shows that Tasmania is considered one of the swing states. They described it as, one of the really kind of key states for this referendum, saying that Tasmania at this stage, as you said, is polling towards a majority no vote. We also spoke to the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre today, which is one of the peak Aboriginal groups in the state. And they have quite a kind of different stance. They are also supporting the no campaign, but for kind of different reasons. Nala Mansell, who we spoke to, said that the voice to Parliament would limit the Aboriginal community to just an advisory role, which they see as racial discrimination. They say that they've already had a voice for more than 200 years in this country, and they'll continue to use that to fight for land return and further Aboriginal rights. Now, as you said, Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price were here. We heard from Warren Mundine about why he thinks that we do need the no result in this campaign.
The real question is out there is about how do we help people who are in tremendous problems in Aboriginal communities out there. And what's his answer? We're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, which could be better spent in those communities, and him flying around the country with his happy clapping crowd, which is not going to do anything for these people.
So, Selena, talk us through what's been seen in Tasmania as we are just now 6 weeks out from this referendum.
So at a political level, Tasmania is the only state or territory with a Liberal government. And despite the very strong no campaign at a federal Liberal level, our Tasmanian Premier, Jeremy Rockcliffe, has been strongly outspoken for the Yes campaign. He says that a voice to Parliament would provide a lot of benefits to the Aboriginal community and help in some of the problem areas such as incarceration rates, health outcomes and education and employment outcomes.
And there's a push to ensure people in the community are informed for all the reasons for and against. So just how's that happening? What is happening?
Well, so tonight there was supposed to be a debate, but it has turned into more of just a no conversation because the organisers were unable to find anyone from the Yes campaign to speak at this event. But the main leading campaigners are Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine, so the reason they're here in Hobart is for this public forum tonight. And then the University of Tasmania is also running a series of public lectures and discussion forums kind of over this period to try to make sure the community here in Tasmania is really informed of both sides of the debate. So tomorrow night we'll see Marcia Langton from the advisory body and also Tasmanian Aboriginal lawyer Michael Mansell talking to the community about their perspectives.
Selena Ross reporting from Hobart.
Let's bring in ABC data analyst Casey Briggs now, who's been looking at the polls. Hi there, Casey. So take us through the national figures.
Yeah, hi Ros. We're watching these polls because they're really just the best indication we've got of public opinion, and as a general rule, they're pretty accurate in measuring that when it comes to political elections at the least. These are all of the polls that we have tracked on The Voice, measuring national levels of support. And the best way to consider these is not to look at each of them individually, but compute mathematically an average trend line across them. So that's what this is doing here. And you can see Yes has had, you don't really need the trend line to see, Yes has had that steady decline in support through the year, while No has improved its numbers. As of today, this polling average has Yes across all of the polls sitting on an average of about 45.3 percentage points. So that is more than 9 percentage points behind No. If a referendum were held today, these polls would have to be more wrong than they were in the 2019 election, which was quite the aberration, in order for Yes to come out ahead. So it's pretty clear Yes is starting on the back foot, at least starting on this final sprint on the back foot. A couple of things I'll just point out though. One, the uncertainty interval here on this polling average is pretty wide. We think, with all probability, Yes is somewhere between 41.8% and 49%. So that is a pretty wide margin of uncertainty there that the Yes support could, theoretically be at. Big reason that's wider than it has been previously is because we haven't had a poll in a number of weeks. One hasn't been conducted for nearly 3 weeks. Newspoll, one of the big regular pollsters in Australia, has taken a bit of a break this month because of some personnel changes at YouGov. And so we're just lacking a little bit of information. And then the other thing that I'll say is, of course, all of that was up to now and it's all historic, and today we have a date and we're expecting that these campaigns on both sides are going to ramp up in intensity dramatically. Yes, for example, we know they've amassed a lot of money. They're saying they have 30,000 volunteers ready to hit the ground and do door-knocking campaigns across the country. So things can absolutely change. And one of the things that the Yes side in particular has been pointing to as a cause for some optimism is they're saying there are lots of undecided people, lots of people just not engaged in this debate just yet. Sometimes they're saying numbers like 30 or 40% of people are undecided. I think what they're doing there is combining people who are genuinely undecided with people who are leaning softly one way or the other. This is just one data point. This is an essential poll that measured not just yes or no, but also strength of support. And they found in August 38% on a hard no, 9% on soft no, so could be persuaded to change their mind, 31% hard yes, 12% soft yes, might yet be persuaded to vote no, and then about 10% in the middle who are genuinely unsure. So when you add up the soft yes, the soft no and the unsures, you get about 30% of people who I think both campaigns might be looking at as in play, up for convincing in the next 6 or so weeks.
We know this referendum, Casey, will also depend on the state results. What do we know there?
Yeah, the state hurdle is arguably the tougher one, I think, to pass here. It all may be a bit academic because if the no vote prevails nationally, the no vote wins and this referendum is defeated. But we know if it's to pass, 50% nationally plus 4 of the 6 states. And the state polling is a little bit hard to draw clear pictures from because there's not as much of it being published and the sample sizes are lower. But if you were to rank the states in order of yes support, New South Wales and Victoria would be near the top, Queensland and WA would be near the bottom, Tasmania and South Australia are a little bit volatile, perhaps sitting in the middle. And so that explains, I think, why it is that the Yes 23 event was held in Adelaide today and the leading no campaigners with the government and Warren Mundine are in Hobart today, because if hypothetically Queensland and WA vote no and New South Wales and Victoria vote yes, and that's a pretty big hypothetical on the numbers we're seeing at the moment, that is a big hypothetical, but if that were the case, South Australia and Tasmania are in the middle. Yes would need both for this referendum to pass, and no only needs one more to vote no. All hypotheticals, but that is explaining why these are such important states.
OK, Casey, thank you.
Well, as voters prepare to head to the polls, the Australian Electoral Commissioner is urging Australians to avoid misinformation when it comes to how to fill out their ballot paper. Speaking to us earlier, AEC Commissioner Tom Rogers asked people to ensure they vote properly on the day.
There has been some misinformation about the voting process over the last week, and I'm really urging everyone to write yes or no in full on the ballot paper, and that way you can make sure your vote actually counts. I'm even nervous talking about it because every time I say it, it inflames an issue that's a non-issue even further. I just urge people, please, if you want your vote to count, write either yes or no. But like at every election for over a century, there are certain provisions in the Act which enable the AEC, enable the electoral authorities, watched by scrutineers, to give effect to the choice of voters. And so there's been some discussions about the issue of ticks and crosses. Again, we put out a media statement last week. I don't want to add to it because it's further inflaming it. Please write yes or no to make sure that your vote will count.
Tom Rogers there. Well, this is where we end our special coverage of the announcement of the Voice to Parliament referendum. If you have any questions or simply need to find out any more information about the referendum, ABC News has set up a comprehensive resource on our website. Head over to abc.net.au/voice referendum for all your needs. That is where we end the coverage. With me has been all the way through Dan Borcher. Great to see you, Dan, over the last hour and a half.
It's been good to spend the day with you.
Also, just before we go, the Prime Minister mentioned this, a hugely emotional event for First Nations people. Warren Mundine certainly was very impassioned about it just a few minutes ago. It's something I think many non-Indigenous people don't fully appreciate or understand. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, that's certainly what I've been seeing and hearing as I've been travelling around the country as a referendum correspondent this year. There are those that are supporting of the Voice to Parliament who say this is simply about doing, in their words, what's right and having a seat at the table to be able to have input on the policies that are affecting their lives, and that they are worried because of how political this has become. On the no side, they are really worried that this is another bureaucracy and that on one hand it either will be too big and unruly, or on the other hand will be tokenistic and not have an impact. And then there are a whole other lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the middle who are saying this is actually an opportunity for us to be talking about treaty. Now, it would be very difficult to have a national treaty. They would have to be in different jurisdictions with the layers of government there, as we're seeing in Victoria, discussions in Queensland, and arguably the closest thing we have to a treaty in Australia is the Southwest Agreement in Western Australia, which is called the Noongar Treaty, although it's strictly not that. But this is also opening up a whole lot of conversations about what it means to be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person in Australia right now, and regardless of how people vote, whether that's landing on a yes or a no, what is at stake for those people that have put their heart and soul into this on both sides is incredibly personal. We have heard that today from Tanya Hosh speaking at the event with the Prime Minister, to Warren Mundine speaking with Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price in Tasmania. And we are going to hear a lot more of those really emotional takes on what this is about. And in a sense, this is part of truth-telling, that we're having conversations that we haven't as a nation before. So kind of regardless of the outcome, there's something really important in that about how we have conversations, how we find the space to disagree respectfully, hopefully, because of course we can't agree on everything. You and I would be out of a job if we agreed on everything, Ros. And so it's really important that we all handle ourselves with listening and asking questions and seeking out all of that information.
Well, we'll be seeing a lot more of you over the next 6 weeks.
Yes.
Thanks for your insights and your thoughts today. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you.